Like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go and inhale it, like sniff it. So they took it, it's in the canister, they sealed it, windows are open.
We're clear for tomorrow.
He said, we're fine. He said, we're fine now.
Okay.
So there's nothing in any of his hazmat resources
Hey.
You already knew Ben wasn't gonna be here.
Yes.
Now Louise is going to be here today.
Okay.
Staying on through Zoom.
Okay. Oh, God. They're dropping like flies, people. Yep.
Please don't. I don't know what I'm talking
Erica, I
about.
know there's no place for town manager report.
Yeah.
But before we get started, is it okay with you if I just brief everyone on
course.
what happens? So, you know.
Really trying to change up here.
Mhm.
The whole program.
Yep.
It's kind of an ugly way to look at things, but it's there.
Nothing to at home.
No Ben tonight?
He has COVID.
I
know.
Oh, that's what he gets for going.
That's how he felt.
So Erica, Friday, if you cross your fingers, we might have the navigator hooked up to the wastewater.
Oh, all right.
I'm gonna cross my fingers and toes.
Okay.
We'll see how it goes.
All right. Yeah, it's kind of funky right now. Since there's no one else here.
Well, this is, I don't have COVID.
Nice to be here. So glad you're here. This is good. Olivia. I know. Where's Kathy?
Okay. No, that's okay, thanks. That's like, what are you playing off, having short jokes today? We already had some of those. Yeah, except that now this one's not. So what is that about?
Mark doesn't need to see.
Did the other one just go off?
No, it's still on.
No, it's not.
It was on before.
Oh, it was. Oh.
Better look at my notes. I'll look at them.
Is the other one still on, Erica?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. No problem. I have a baby, so I'm, yeah. But it is what it is.
Ben is logged in.
Are we getting people on Zoom, Lauren?
Not right now, we have staff on Zoom.
Okay.
We're gonna have Ben and Luis.
On Zoom.
Comes in.
Yep.
Mayor Ben. Here he is.
Oh, Luis is on as a. He signed on as an attendee.
Yeah.
How are you?
Good. So, you got the fourth job going. The versions.
Yeah.
It's channel with 90 feet wide and 100 feet. Like a 6-foot rock. Biggest one.
Yeah.
No, it's in June.
Mark and Susan. Okay.
Should we wait for Mark and Susan or go ahead and get started?
Just give him a couple more.
Okay. I was gonna say, and you were gonna give,
No.
and we were gonna have you give a little update at the beginning anyway, so
No,
I'll wait till Chris gets back.
there was a release. And it was too much. It was overwhelming. And so rather than decided to try. And maybe I'm supposed to go to work to see if it's time for us to pull this in. Yeah, because the sentiment has now settled. But maybe more slowly than it was. Yeah. Yeah. And then peek into that.
For those on Zoom, I'm just gonna wait a couple more minutes to get started until we have a few more people here. Not just a few more random people, a few more key personnel. I want to fill the room.
That basement.
Cool.
Hello, I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, I haven't seen you for a while. You got a little tall.
I did.
We have 4 sitting in the room, so I feel like we could.
Still growing?
2 and 2. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for attending our work session tonight. I'm Erica Sparhawk, and I'm filling in for Ben, although he is, Mayor Ben, he is attending on Zoom, but he is out sick. And Luis is also here via Zoom. So I'm grateful that we have hybrid meeting opportunities for when we're not feeling well and we don't get each other sick. And so we're gonna, our agenda tonight is a water discussion. And then we're gonna talk about housing and maybe touch on the lodging tax that we've been discussing. But before we get started, it's not on the agenda, but Lauren's gonna, our town manager, for those of you who don't know, is gonna give a quick update for the trustees for a few things that happened at town hall today.
Okay, thanks, Erica.
Yep.
This afternoon, excuse me, a couple of our police officers answered a trespass call, and there was an individual, known drug user who was trespassing, and they ended up having to take him to the ground, and in his pocket was a substance that when opened made a couple of our officers ill, but no one knew what it was. So in an abundance of caution, we evacuated the building. We had the two officers and one of our administrative staff be checked out by medical personnel. And it turned out that, excuse me, of course, now I'll be coughing. It turned out that we actually had DEA come and check the substance, and they think it was a combination of some sort of vaping liquid stored inside a disassembled lithium battery with acid in it. So we had two of our personnel sent to the hospital just to be checked out, but everyone so far appears to be fine. The building is back open. Staff got to go home an hour early. So luckily, that was an emergency that almost was.
Right.
So I just want to make sure everybody was aware.
I think if anybody has any questions about it or anything, follow up with Lauren maybe after the meeting or tomorrow. So now we'll kick off the water discussion. And so I think Kevin and Marco Mira are going to get us started. Is that right? Or who wants to kick us off?
I think the plan was that we would go through kind of in the order that the memo
Great.
was put together. Is that accurate?
That sound good, Lonnie?
Yeah, and so my piece here will be just to summarize the thoughts that were shared and see if we can come to any conclusions and answer questions and so forth. Thank you.
Erica, could I add a quick thought?
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry I'm not there tonight, everybody. I picked up COVID while traveling, evidently. I said that if I didn't pick it up on that trip, I probably never would, and it called my bluff. So here I am, but I'm doing fine. I just wanted to frame the discussion a little bit. You know, I think that before we launch into the details, as trustees, we get a lot of questions from the community whenever there's development. People ask, do we have enough water to service growth? And I think that's a valid question, and we need to have clear answers to it. So that's one thing I think we should be kind of keeping our eye out for. The other is, should we do something? Should we do more to reduce water demand and water use, water consumption? What are we already doing? You know, we do have like a tiered rate structure in place that I think we'll hear about. So I think that's another thing that we should be looking for and talking about is, you know, do we have a need to reduce our water use? And if so, what type of water use? Is it indoor? Is it outdoor? Is it seasonal? Is it year round? Those sorts of things. And then the other part is just the update. And as we think through the changes in our expectations for the natural, you know, water flows because of climate change, and is that factored into our planning? So just to kind of frame the discussion, those are the things that I hope we can start to get to. So, you know, you'll notice that we're not talking about specific strategies to reduce demand tonight, because we're talking about, should we embrace some strategies to reduce demand? And if so, then that would be another meeting and another set of topics.
Thanks, Ben.
Perfect. So I'm going to be referring to my memo quite a bit, both in the discussion and looking down at it. So I'm not ignoring you all. I'm just trying to stay on track. Yeah. Can you hear me, Ben?
Yes, loud and clear. Everything sounds great.
Okay. So the first part of this, just a couple of housekeeping items. There were several graphs in the packet showing different things, and they're based on water years. That's why they start in November and end in October. A water year is a pretty standard concept in Colorado, and I think most people get it, but that's why it's not a calendar year. So in case there was a question about that. Um, you know, starting the discussion, my main point is to describe how we operate the town's system. That's the main point of this. So I'll go through the components of the system and how they, in my mind, tie together. Because I think if you just look at how much water do you pump out of the ground, it doesn't give a clear picture based on the, if you want to call it the ecosystem, the hydrology of this area. And one of the terms I'm going to use is consumptive. Just be aware that my use of the word consumptive should not be construed with a legal definition of consumptive use. They may be similar, but when I'm talking about consumption, I'm talking about water that is taken out of our system. You want to think about it as Roaring Fork Valley, the Colorado River Valley in Colorado, however you want to think about it, that is not returned to the system here in Carbondale. So just to be clear, when I talk about consumptive use, that's what I'm talking about. As kind of a contrast to the way things work here, if you think about water use in the Midwest or even trans mountain diversions, I view those in the context of my word consumptive as, if it's a trans mountain diversion from this watershed, I view that as 100% consumptive to where it came from. It's never coming back here. Same concept as if you go further into the Midwest and you talk about people who provide potable water for their citizens through wells that are drilled into confined aquifers that can't recharge. It's kind of that same concept. You're taking it from somewhere where it can't get back in. It doesn't mean that that water isn't reused, but it's never going back where it came from. So hopefully that's understood.
I think that was a good clarification in your memo as well. That was really helpful to understand.
Yeah. And so the first thing I'll talk about is the different aspects. We have our potable water system, we have our raw water system or the ditches, and then we also have return flows that go through our wastewater treatment plant that are cleaned and then reintroduced to the system. So on the potable water side of things, we have 3 treatment plants: the Nettle Creek treatment plant, the Roaring Fork treatment plant, and the Crystal treatment plant, if you will. That's part of it, but we also have 2 water tanks, one up on White Hill and one out above RVR. And then all the underground piping that delivers the water from where we produce it to where it's ultimately used. The 3 treatment plants currently have a combined capacity to treat about 5 million gallons of water a day. The first graph that I have up here shows our cumulative annual water production by water year starting in 2015-16 and running through May of this year. So what you can see is, so far this year has been the lowest amount of water we've had to produce in that time frame. And in general, it seems to be going downward. You can see the effects of the drought in 2018. You can also see in this area right here, that blue line is actually 2019 and 2020. And if you look, that blue line really starts climbing in about April of 2020. And I would suspect that the vast majority of that is related to COVID and everybody staying home. you know, we have people that leave the community every day for work, but if they're all here, they're going to be consuming water that they would typically be using in other places. So I view that as an anomaly on this, and I think the general trend is downward.
Mhm.
One other thing I forgot to mention, please, if you have any questions, just interrupt me.
People were also washing their hands, washing their produce, washing every surface, like.
Right.
I think in general there was, yeah, I think that's interesting to see it here.
Yeah. So, you know, in general, we range between 300 and 350 million gallons a year of potable water production. The next chart I had in there, I'll pause right there for just a second. This is just a chart of the average daily water production per month for those given years. And I think it kind of shows that same trend that we just talked about in the cumulative look. It's just a little bit different way of looking at it. Same thing happened in 2020 with this.
Hey, Kevin, I will jump in there since you invited it. What's your theory on that? Why? I mean, I think most of us, if you had asked us to predict what we would see in these graphs, we would have said, well, with population increase, we would see an increase in water use, and it's the opposite. So what's your hunch?
You know, initially, what I would say is there's probably during the summertime some climatological factors that play into this. But if you look at during the wintertime, I would attribute a lot of that to the current building codes and the plumbing codes requiring efficient fixtures and those sorts of things that are just naturally occurring as things build out and as people, even in older homes, replace fixtures. That's what I would say, Ben.
Okay, thanks. I mean, this is one of those that I think is a really important one for all of us to be on the same page with when we talk about we need to add housing for our community to survive with affordability and all that. And is that putting a strain on our water system? And according to this, it's not. And I think that's a really important kind of take home point at this stage.
Gotcha. And I would tend to agree with that. You know, if you're looking at this, you can see the influence of outdoor watering, obviously, in the summer months. But, you know, just keep in mind, we don't even quite see a doubling most of the time. And communities that would solely rely on potable water production for irrigation during the irrigation season would probably see a tripling or a quadrupling of that. So that kind of shows the effect of our raw water system on our water production. And that's important because if we, for some reason, had to supply all the water in potable form, it would not only impact our capacity. I mean, obviously, I still think we could meet it, but delivering it might be a different story because it may take upsizing pipes around town to deliver that much water through our distribution system versus the raw water irrigation that we have. Next thing I'm going to jump into is wastewater return flows. And those of you who were here last year heard me preach about this too, but I think it's important to take that into consideration, particularly with the way our hydrology and our ecology works here. Again, just because we produce a certain amount of water doesn't mean that that's used consumptively to the system. You know, I already went through part of that first paragraph with the discussion about Midwest and Trans Mountain diversions. The important thing here, I think, to look at is the difference between winter usage, winter total water production, and winter wastewater return flows, which, if I'm on track, no, this will give you an idea of the total. This is just from 2015 up through May of this year. How much total water have we produced? And what effect does that offset by return flows from the wastewater treatment plant? So in this one, the orange line is the total amount of water produced. But when you subtract out the wastewater return flows to get kind of a net effect on the system, if you will, you end up with the blue line.
Does the return flow is just what's measured flowing out of the pipe from the treatment plant, or is it a calculation of stuff that's going theoretically into an aquifer or something from outdoor use?
No, it's a measurement of what flows out of the pipe at the treatment plant.
So conceivably, the environment is also probably returning more water to the system through gravels and stuff.
Absolutely, particularly during irrigation system, and not necessarily just in Carbondale, but up and down the valley. The irrigation you see happening actually contributes to return flows later in the year when there might not be as much available water just flowing from the source.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, without diving too far off topic, an example of this would be actually in 2018 when the Ella Ditch call came on. The Ella Ditch is a senior water right, but it is not senior to the Carbondale Ditch or the Rockford Ditch and a couple others. But we never had to make a call on the Rockford or the Carbondale because there was enough water returning to the system between the Ella Head Gate and where we take it out that it was available for us to use. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So the next two graphs are just splitting that graph into summer and winter. The first one is, winter total production versus the wastewater treatment plant return flows. And you can see in the wintertime, remember, this is cumulative over 6.5 years. So the difference between those lines is actually what we've removed from the system. And in general, during the winter months, that's running, we return about 80% of the water we produce to the system during the winter months. And for clarification, winter is November through March. Now, if you contrast that with the next one, which is the summer, you'll see a much bigger gap in that, which is to be expected, from an outdoor water use perspective. Granted, some of it makes it back in over time, but there's a much larger delta there. However, if you look at that, we're still looking at returning almost 50%, 48% is still returned during that summer season through wastewater treatment plant return flows. And if you want to think about that in like different terms, that's about 548,000 gallons a day that is not being returned, which equates to about 0.85 CFS if you are talking about just flows. So 0.85, not 8.5, not 85. Again, this would be much larger if we didn't have the raw water system to augment irrigation use and this is a rough estimate, about 70% of town uses raw water irrigation. Any questions about the wastewater return flows before I jump over to ditches?
If anybody hasn't taken a tour of the wastewater treatment plant, I'd highly recommend it. The staff there was awesome. I took a gaggle of 9-year-olds with me, and it was really cool. It was really fascinating. And they now understand how it flows.
Excellent. And yes, I would encourage any of you that have the time and the desire, whether it's a wastewater treatment plant, whether it's our water treatment plants, we're happy to go through those with you guys, answer questions, take you to the ditch head gates, any of that. We enjoy making sure that you're informed. So, because then you can make informed decisions.
Yeah.
In general, we operate the ditch systems in town April 15th through October 15th. That fluctuates depending on what days they fall on, and sometimes a few ditches go a little later, but that's in general. We do have interest in the Bowles and Holland ditch, Carbondale ditch, a small portion of the Ella ditch, the Lowline ditch, the Rockford ditch, and the Weaver ditch. However, we only operate from a town staff perspective the Carbondale and the Weaver. And we talk with RVR actually does the actual physical changing of head gates and things like that, but we stay in contact about that. The rest of the ditches are generally operated by our upstream neighbors. We do make a concerted effort on those three to look at the flows in the river and adjust. What you would typically see is adjustments slowly downward as flows in the crystal recede during the summer and fall. So, questions about those? Mark and Susan are here to talk a little bit about rights. I'm not talking about rights, I'm talking about operations. So any questions operationally on that?
I don't think so.
Damn, we're good.
You were, I mean, your memo is very thorough, so.
No,
Yep.
I'm just kidding. So kind of a summary, I decided to look at 2021 because that was our last full water year. And, if you look at demographic information provided by the Census Bureau, and for those of you who want to check my math on this, I'm going to tell you there's a trick to this, because Carbondale does not just supply potable water to the town or the residents inside the town limits. We also provide water to folks along the Nettle Creek line, Setank, and CRMS. So I factored that into this. But if you look at our total potable water production, our per capita demand was about 116 gallons per person per day over that time frame. Now, there's so many different ways this can be calculated. I'm telling you straight up, this is total water production. So this includes commercial uses, residential uses, our uses, and the wastewater. It's just total production divided by population served. Just to be clear on that. If you look at that and discount that by the amount of water that's returned to the system through the wastewater treatment plant, that same number drops to about 46 gallons per person per day. And in general, it probably goes without saying, but I'm here, so I'll say it anyway. Our highest demand months are usually June, July, and August. Typically, those demands over the month's average range from 1.2 million gallons to 1.4 million gallons a day. So if you look at that and contrast that to our current treatment capacity, as well as our water portfolio, I think we have the ability to produce the amount of water that this town needs for the foreseeable future.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was very well described and spoken, so we really appreciate it. I guess we'll move on to the next section, which will be the water rights.
Water rights. Favorite topic. So, as I think most of you know, I've worked on the town's water rights for a long time now. I started helping with them in about 1999. So that's, 23 years ago, I guess. Susan Ryan, who's next to me here, I know most of you have met her because she's helped out on some things since she joined our firm in November. But before she was working with me, she was on the bench in Glenwood Springs as the water referee for Water Division 5. So she sat in adjudicating water cases for 5 or 6 years, hundreds of them throughout the entire Colorado River Basin from Grand Junction all the way up to Summit County, and has a tremendous amount of water experience. And before that, she was a partner with a Denver-based law firm that specialized in water. So we've got new additional water expertise here. So she's here to critique me and all the rest of us.
I'm sure you'll do fine.
So I'm going to start really basic, and I'll try to keep things moving here because I know we don't have a ton of time, but sometimes I think it helps to start with the foundation, particularly where we have a couple of new folks who have been part of the discussion before. At a real base level, what we're obviously talking about here is an overall shortage of water before or after climate change. We're water short in this state, in this part of the world. And our water law system reflects that. For those of us from the East Coast, like me and Marty and Colin and Kevin and others, there's a totally different system because there's a line. I find this very interesting. This is where I can geek out like an engineer, but there's a line through the middle of the country, through roughly the center of Kansas, that is the 100th meridian. And just climate wise, at least historically, maybe this is changing too, but if you're east of that line, more than 20 inches of rain falls a year. And that's generally about the amount you need to grow grass and crops. And if you're west of that line, you have varying degrees of less than that, unless you're in like little pockets of Northern California or the Pacific Northwest. And so our system and all the states around us have developed a water allocation system because there's never enough for everybody. Whereas in the East, if you're on the Chesapeake Bay or the Hudson River or whatever, it's just, you can use a fair share of it. It's kind of an equity-based system. There's plenty to go around. Don't take too much. Go ahead and put your pump in and use it. That's not what we have. So our system is, as we all know, based on priority. We often call it first in time, first in right. And the priority of a water right is, in Colorado anyway, we have a court-driven system. Most of the other states around us, like Utah and Wyoming, have permits where state officials issue permits. Here, judges, like Susan until 6 months ago, actually decide about the adjudication of water rights. And it's the date that a court signs off on your water right that establishes your priority. So you can use a ditch for 100 years, but if you didn't actually go to court or pay a lawyer to go to court, your priority would be today if you hadn't done that yet. So it's really important to get to court and get those dates established. And then the state does have, we don't have a permanent system to allocate the water rights, but once they're established, we have an administrative system where state officials regulate the water rights. And it's kind of a hierarchical system where we have local water commissioners who are kind of the equivalent of the line duty police officers who drive around and do the regulation and inspections. And then their bosses are assistant division engineers and division engineers. Our division, so to speak, is Division 5, which is in Glenwood Springs. And then there's a state agency under the governor, which is Division of Water Resources in Denver, where the state engineer is. And that's where the top of the food chain is as far as the administrative piece of water administration. There's 7 divisions in Colorado where they're divided by the 7 major river basins, which are, the Yampa, and the White is combined with the Yampa it had to go somewhere. So the White and the Yampa, the Colorado, which includes the Gunnison, San Juan and Animas down in Durango, which is Division 7. And then Alamosa is Division 3. And then on the Front Range, we've got the Arkansas in the southeast and the South Platte in the northeast. And those are our 7 divisions. Each of those, not in Denver, each of those have regional water courts. Like even the Denver, if you're in the city of Denver and you want to go get a water court approval, you have to go out to Greeley because that's where the water court is. So they're very regional, Glenwood, Steamboat, Greeley, et cetera. Let's see. So what those state officials do is when there's a shortage, the state will begin curtailing. If somebody says, hey, I'm not getting my water, they have a priority and they're entitled to have the state curtail water use of everyone junior to them. So if I have a 1970 water right and I'm not getting what I need from the river, I say, hey, I'm short. And then the state goes up the food chain, starting it with 2022 actually, and coming backwards and begins curtailing water rights until there's enough in the river to satisfy me. And if they curtail all those and I still don't get enough water, well, then that's just the way it goes. And that probably means somebody with a 1908 water right is going to start complaining because it's becoming more and more severe drought. So all water rights play within that priority system. And another thing that used to be unique to Colorado, it's not anymore, but we've integrated groundwater and surface water. So wells and aquifers, generally speaking, are all part of that same priority system. It's not, I say generally because there are little pockets like over in Denver, there's some really deep confined aquifers that have separate permit systems that don't play by the rules I just described. But over here on the West Slope, with very, very limited circumstances, if you have a well, you're probably part of the same system. And it's, even if you drill it up on Missouri Heights, a few miles away from the Roaring Fork, you're still considered legally to be putting a straw in the Roaring Fork. The only question is timing, because as you pull water through the aquifer and the timing of it getting back, it's not like the ditch is operating as directly real time, but it's still affecting the same water system. The types of water rights we have include surface water rights, which are usually ditches, wells. Wells are not just traditional wells like we think of with the town, but also ponds that if you dig a pond deep enough to encounter groundwater and it fills on its own and begins evaporating, that's treated as a well, not a surface water right. Storage water rights are reservoirs, ponds, and even some water tanks. The newest water rights, all those water rights have been around for 100-something years. But there are 2 newer water rights. One is in-stream flows, which are something we talk about here on the Crystal and throughout the Roaring Fork Basin a lot. They were not created until like the 1970s by statute. And the only holder of an in-stream flow water right is a state agency called the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So they can go to court and it's the same system. They go in and say, we'd like this amount of water, Judge, would you please award it? And then when the date the judge says yes is the date of their priority, but that means there aren't any in-stream flow water rights that are older than about 1970, whereas lots of other water rights, like the ditches we're talking about with the town, are far senior to 1970. So generally speaking on the Crystal, there are plenty of scenarios where it's possible that the ditches are taking enough water that the in-stream flow is no longer satisfied, but the in-stream flow cannot place a call back against those senior water rights. The last kind of water right that's new is called an RICD, which is a recreation in-channel diversion. Most of you probably remember that about 10, 12 years ago, we took the town through a proceeding in the Division 5 Water Court and got an approval for a recreational in-channel diversion on the Roaring Fork. So the town now holds, it's not been built yet, but the town holds water rights that would allow it, if it builds water features in the river like Basalt and Pickens County have now done on the Pickens County side of Basalt. There's a water right for that to allow the town to call for water in the recreation season, which I think in that water court approval is defined from, I think it's May 1 through October 1, which would allow the town to have more water come down the Roaring Fork if under that scenario. But again, it's a very junior water right because it wasn't approved until 10 years ago. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was late first off, but could you please explain to me the difference between senior and junior water rights? Is that based upon the year that they got them?
Yes, it's generally speaking, it's the date the judge signed the water approval. So if it's a 1908 adjudication 100 years ago, that's very senior. And if Susan signed it a year ago before she
That's
started
junior.
working with me, it's very junior. But it's
Okay.
generally speaking, it's the date the judge approved something in Colorado.
Okay, just to make sure I was clear on that.
There's a separate tie-breaking system, which is called appropriation dates.
I don't think
I
we
can
need
go
that
through
right
it.
now.
But yeah, it's generally
thank you.
the date, we call it an adjudication date.
I can talk about that over a beer or something.
You'll love it. It'll be fascinating. So those are the types of water rights: surface, surface, groundwater, storage, in-stream flows, and RICDs. The types of water court proceedings you can go through include the initial proceeding to get a water right confirmed. It can either be confirmed what we call absolute, which means you've used the water already and you just want the court to confirm that, or it can be conditional, which is like our RICD water right, where you haven't actually built it yet, but you go into court and say, I'd like to build it in the future, but I don't want my priority to be 10 years from now. I want it to be now. And the court will award you a conditional priority, but that means you have to show the court routinely. You go in every 6 years after that and provide updates about what you're doing. And the court will cancel the water right if you're not showing what they call reasonable diligence to keep that water right alive. Another type of water right proceeding that's important is called a change of water rights. The town has been through that in the past. If you have a water right, it's determined to be in a location and for a certain use. The classic example being a ditch. You can divert 3 miles up the Crystal River on the left bank and you can use it to irrigate 40 acres for alfalfa. If you want to change the type of use, meaning you'd like to use that same water for drinking water instead of for alfalfa, you have to go to water court and get a change approved. If you want to move the diversion 3 miles from where it is there to have it down in town, you've also got to get a change approved. Changes are the most complex and sometimes the most arduous water rights proceedings, because anytime somebody files for a change, you have to prove that you're not using more water than you did historically, and you're limited to not just the amount diverted, but to the consumptive use. And that's why Kevin made the comment he did a little while ago about consumption. It's really important. So in my alfalfa example, if you wanted to stop growing alfalfa and to take the amount of water that was associated with that somewhere else, what the court would do is look at first of the season. Well, what dates did you water your alfalfa? And that would cap you. You can't take water before April 1. You can't take water after August or October 15th in my example. And then engineers would help calculate how much consumptive water did that crop actually consume. Just the crop consumption, not the extra that goes down to the groundwater table, not any runoff that just happened to be because the farmer put a little too much on at a certain time, only the amount that's biologically required for the plant, which tends to be a very small, not 1%, but it can be as little as like 40% of the amount that's come in the ditch historically. So farmers will call that taking a haircut. If you do a change of water right, you shrink the water right, at least the diversion amount, because you're limited to what was used consumptively in the past. And the way the court does that is, like I said, look at the dates, look at the diversions, and then calculate out that amount, and then limit in the future decree. It says you can't take more than this volume or this rate or these dates. And so you end up with terms and conditions placed on it. Another process that's helpful to know about is abandonment. If a water right goes unused for more than 10 years, the state has a system where they're always watching that and kind of auditing. And if a water right sits unused for more than a decade, they will list it for abandonment. There's a process and notice is provided to the owner. The owner has a chance to come in and provide an explanation as to why they might not have used it or whether there might have been justification. But at the end of the day, if you don't prove that there's an ongoing intent to keep using the water, the state can then cause the abandonment of the water. And if that happens, it's just canceled. And it just as if it did never happen. So the next guy in line with the next most junior water right would get water when it didn't before, if that makes sense. The Roaring Fork Basin here, it's an interesting, we're very blessed compared to, say, the Front Range, with a very prolific natural basin compared to a lot of other basins in the West. But it's got a lot of pressure on it. There's transbasin diversions up high and downstream. The water right that really governs everything are the old, huge water rights that water the peach orchards and the fields that are north and south of Colorado River and Grand Junction and Palisade. Those water rights really drive the whole west slope, and that's what really determines who can use what when, because in most dry years from now until October, let's say, that call is on, everybody has to live with it. If you're senior to it, you don't have to worry about it. And if you've been using your water since prior to October 1977, you don't have to worry about it because the federal government releases water from Green Mountain Reservoir up north of Silverthorne that compensates that water right. But if you're junior to October 1977, that's a real dilemma, 4 months a year where you probably have a call against your water right. Another thing we talk about and you hear about and certainly read about a lot lately is the Colorado River Compact. Nobody's exactly, and this is Mark Hamilton's subjective view of the compact. There are going to be thousands of people with different opinions on it, but my takeaway would be that nobody knows exactly where this is going to go from here. We all know supplies are shrinking. We know the math that went into the original compact was overly assuming more water than there is today, at least. And so there's less to divide than it calls for, and the formula doesn't work, and everybody's trying to come up with how we're going to fix it. A lot of folks who do water rights work like we do have presumed for a long time that because the compact was passed in 1922, the water rights senior to 1922 will probably be protected in any scenario involving a call from California and Arizona against Colorado kind of thing. And the good news is if that's correct, a good, not all, but a sizable portion of Carbondale's supply is pre-1922, including the South Nettle Creek spring and the sizable portion of the Carbondale ditch. So that we like to think that provides significant protection. And those numbers are the numbers that those two water rights total are in excess of the present or even likely future demands that Kevin just laid out for you. So that's a big positive. We talked about in-stream flows. On the Crystal in particular, I know that's a focus of you all and some of the folks who've come tonight to listen. The Crystal is its own interesting little system. There's no reservoir like Root Eye or Green Mountain at the top, so there's no ability to release water down when needed. It's really just the natural flow, and then it diminishes each year. It's governed by some very big ditches. I would mention, we don't want to be pointing fingers at anybody, but there's some really big ditches that whether it be the Rockford we share an interest in down here, but also the Sweet Jessup and the East Mesa that come up much higher up towards Redstone are significant senior water rights to the in-stream flow on the river. Another thing I'd mention is if you certainly don't have any obligation to use water all the time, but if you do leave your water in the stream just because you chose not to use it, whether it be for conservation or just simply because you were doing maintenance or whatever, the way the water right system works is the next person down who has a ditch that's in priority can take that water. It's not protected. We're not allowed to say, we're not using it today, so we're going to give it to Grand Junction. You're not allowed to do that. It just goes into the system and then it gets used by the next person who has a legal water right that's able to divert from wherever that water is. I think Kevin already touched on the not from a water right standpoint, but from a structural standpoint, what the main sources are of the town. I generally view it, and the map in the packet is a very good map. Generally I categorize the sources in roughly 5 categories. We've got the Nettle Creek Springs, very, very high quality water coming out of Mount Cypress at a high elevation with it's basically wilderness above there. So it's an ideal location for, from a quality standpoint, protecting the water quality of that spring. It's been providing this town water for a long time. So that's a main piece. The Crystal River wells, we've got 2 wells that are in the park just across, on this side of RBR. Those have kind of, I don't know how you're using them today. In the past, I would have kind of described them as more supplemental, but they've become more regularly used, yes?
They're still supplemental, particularly and sorry to jump in, but I think it's worth mentioning. When we're talking about winter water usage, the vast majority of our water comes from the Nettle Creek treatment plant. We still run the Crystal wells. We still run the Roaring Fork wells just in kind of a maintenance mode. But the vast majority of winter water usage in town is out of Nettle Creek.
Another source of water, obviously, which is mostly non-potable water, is the various Crystal River ditches. Kevin's memo talks about it, some on each side of the river, but those in combination obviously provide, I think you said 80% of irrigation in town is from the non-potable side of things, something like 75, some, so 3/4 or so. Unfortunately, not my house, but most houses are Susan's. Another source is the Roaring Fork well field, of course. We're down behind the rodeo grounds on the Roaring Fork. We've got 3 wells operating and more approved by the water court and planned for development in the future. Those, as the town has grown and now that we have a sophisticated modern water treatment plant down there, those have become a very important. Those I wouldn't call supplemental. I think those are primary, or alongside the Meadow Creek. Those are the 2 backbone sources of our system. And then in addition to those, the town in the past 20 years has gone out and got contracts for Rudai water. So we have 500 acre-feet of water storage in Rudai that's available. Historically, it hasn't been used for a lot, not directly by the town. It does provide what we call augmentation for the well that's at the rodeo grounds. So there's a small amount of water that's released every year from Rudai, so we can keep pumping water at the rodeo grounds. The great bulk of that is really there as kind of belt and suspenders for future water planning for the town. It's kind of, storage is kind of a battery, sort of like when you build solar, you need a battery to have the power at night. This just makes it's more redundant, it's more flexible going forward. But as of yet, we have not gone to water court to officially add that Rudai water in as a source for the town, but that can certainly be done in the future. It's not unlike, Carbondale situation with Rudai is very, very similar. Most of the municipalities from Snowmass to Palisade have some amount of Rudai water for future, whether it be growth or drought protection or whatever it may be. Most of the municipalities have gone out and gotten a Rudai supply. It's kind of like a mortgage where you pay an annual fee, but ultimately it gets paid off. And at that point, you just have to share a pro rata amount of the dam operation and maintenance costs, and you're no longer paying principal on your mortgage. So we're in the process of repayment, but the first contract, I think we should be getting close, or we paid it off.
We're paid off
On both? Okay, thanks. That's news to me. So just operation and maintenance, which is good. I think when I was talking about change of water rights a minute ago, I forgot one thing, and I'll let it go and take questions or ask Susan to add anything or move on. But it was back on changes of water rights when I said you can give up that alfalfa field. The other thing I didn't mention is that one of the conditions of a change case, as you would expect, would be that the alfalfa no longer be watered. And so when you take an agricultural irrigation water right and you change it to another use, you normally end up with a water court decree condition that says that that field needs to be monumented and permanently removed from irrigation. So the state knows that there's no duplication of the water use, that you're not expanding the use. So anything you would add?
I guess I would just add a few things quickly. This is just kind of at the 30,000 foot level. Mark started by talking about the prior appropriation system that we have in Colorado, and you often hear that Colorado is a strict prior appropriation system. And I think it's just important to note that that really does give you security in a drought type condition. So you know what your water right is, and you know how much water you can get during times of scarcity. So that's really the upside of having a strict prior appropriation. And I think it's just important to remember that when you start thinking about your water rights portfolio and how things fit together, that you know exactly when there's scarcity or drought, whatever term you want to use, how much water you can divert under your existing water rights. And then the second thing I would add, I also think it's important to think about your paper water rights, which is what the court decrees, what you have legally available to you on paper versus what you actually have wet water wise. So what your system can handle, what you can actually divert. And so to optimize your system, you need both paper water and wet water. And so I think it's important to kind of link those together, which is what we're trying to do here, link both together so you can get a full understanding of what the portfolio is and what it looks like moving forward.
That's a really good point.
I like the term paper water.
Yeah. I think I made it up, but
I like it.
And it's entirely typical that paper water is in excess of wet water. That's very, very common.
Well, if you look at some of the older like water rights, like Sweet Jessup is 50 CFS. And so that's clearly their paper right.
Well, they have a pipe
And
that can divert 50 CFS.
Right. But I know they can't. I think when we talked about it in 2018, as I recall, there was less than that available in the river. So they weren't diverting that much because they couldn't scrape the river clean. they didn't have that technology, but that was kind of eye-opening to me that, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions for our speakers here? Oh,
All I was gonna point out is there was a ton of good information in Lonnie's portion of the memo. There's some discussions about per capita usage and things like that in there that are all calculated a little differently. But if anybody has a question on any one of those numbers and how that compares to Carbondale calculated the same way, I have those numbers if you want them.
okay, thank you, Kevin.
Yep.
Mark O'Meara, did you have anything you'd like to add?
All right, Colin's got some.
Questions, so if you want to know.
I was just wondering about figures 2 and 3. Is that right, Kevin? Are you going to go through that or Mark? It sounds like this is kind of the overall analysis of our system's rights and potentially under drought conditions.
If I'm recalling correctly, let me see if I can get there, Colin.
It's right after the map.
Yep.
These are Scott Viper's bar charts, Kevin.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think a little bit of what this has to do with is what Susan just described, the difference between a paper and a wet water right.
Yeah.
That's kind of an example graphically of that.
And it also seemed to, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to say that the town's rights, enough of them are senior that we could meet our needs with those senior rights, even with a call.
Well, if we're talking about the compact call, we have certain water rights that are, we believe, protected against it. But when we talk, we need to differentiate in demand. If it's the demand that Kevin's talking about, which is the potable water demand, on a year-round basis, so basically excluding irrigation, I think it seems pretty clear we can meet that. If it is to irrigate every inch of irrigated ground that's being flood irrigated or sprinkler irrigated with all the ditches now, I don't know that I could say that conclusively that would be enough, but it's certainly close.
And the thing I would add to that is that's why, for example, in 2018, I believe the charter or code, however you want to call it, gives the town town manager the ability to implement water restrictions if we need to.
Okay.
And that's the other side of that. That's where we would go first in the absence of wet water.
Sure.
Would be to conservation measures.
Okay.
Any other discussion?
Did that answer your question, Colin?
Yeah.
Okay. Marty.
Well, this is the same general topic. Didn't we a year or two ago, when we got money from the federal government, weren't we putting money towards drilling another well? Do I remember that correctly?
We still are in the process of identifying a location to do that.
Okay, so that's still in the works.
Yes.
Okay, just,
In
I hadn't
fact,
heard about that for a while, so just want to make sure it was still in the works.
Yeah, sometimes things move more slowly than you would like them to, but Mark and I just had a meeting about a month ago related to that.
Okay, like I said, just want to make sure that was still in the works.
It is.
Thank you.
And to be clear about that, that is, as Mark said, having belt and suspenders for our system. Right now, if we had the wet water and we cranked everything up, you could say we wouldn't need that, but you can't just have a system that doesn't have redundancy to it.
You also can't predict the future,
Right.
what the future demand is going to be 20 or 30 years from now. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, seeing some of the struggles that different neighboring communities have had when they've had water go down in one place and have to completely shut water off in areas, which not saying that that couldn't happen with us, but when I had a strong sense of relief when we went over this a couple of years ago of the redundancies that we have, and now we have even more after that 2018 call, and we realized we needed to get water to our customers up along Middle Creek. So I just think that's something I would love for us to make sure we share with our community, and maybe it's an FAQ on our website or something where it's just really helping folks understand the strong position that we're in with our water rights, along with the redundancies that we've built into our system, so that they know that it might not all be perfect. We're still working on things, but we're in a really strong position with our water, both in the ditches and our potable water. And I think that's important for folks to understand.
If I could come back to one thing to
Yeah.
answer Colin's question on the other chart here, which I hadn't studied. I apologize for not answering it right away. I think Scott Pfeiffer is a water rights consultant we've used for years. He's in the process of trying to retire, and we haven't let him completely yet, but he's not here tonight. The second chart, figure 3 that he's got here. This, I believe what Scott was trying to show is that what happens when you change an agricultural water right to development to a degree. What you have on the left side of the picture is the Bowles and Holland ditch from 1962 to 1996, which are the years before RVR was developed. And the Bowles and Holland serves RVR. From 1996 forward, you can see the water use after RVR. And so what this tells me is that when you have historic flood irrigation like the Perry's had out there, on a diversion amount, that's going to take up a lot more water. When you convert to homes, and some of it is hardscape driveways and whatever, there's going to be some non-irrigated areas and rooftops. And then the lawns themselves are sprinkler irrigated, and the golf course is also sprinkler irrigated. That's resulting in a significant lower demand on the Bowles and Holland system. So generally speaking, when we see historic agricultural irrigation convert to municipal development, surprisingly, because of what Kevin was telling you about 80% of the water going back to the river through the plant and the efficiencies associated with sprinklers and dry up of driveways and whatever, you end up with less overall water use.
That is exactly what that chart was intended to demonstrate. And you can see the two average lines on there, dropping from 5,000 acre feet being diverted to 2,000. And that's about a 60% reduction.
And that's diversions, of course, not consumption, but it's still, that's what the river would be affected by.
So does that reset our right at the new level, you think, or?
If the town needed to change, if the diversions have been reduced as shown here and the town needed to change those water rights again, then yes, it would. But as I mentioned a while ago, the town has already gone through a water rights change case in 1988. And so water rights have already been changed unless they need to be changed again, which is always possible. But if the initial change from agricultural irrigation to municipal has already happened, then we've kind of already banked our use based on the prior history, if that makes sense. But if another change needed to happen, that's a good point, Chris. It's not set in stone, but generally the courts look 25 years back, the most recent 25 years, to establish what historical use is.
Great, thanks for that explanation. What?
Ben has his hand
Okay, I
up.
was just gonna say, let's see if Ben or Luis have any questions or anything they want to add.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for all this information so far. And I think there are people there in the audience who I'm looking forward to hearing from too, but I can't see that, so I'm not sure. But maybe you could just scroll back up, whoever's controlling the screen there, to figure 2, because I feel like we breezed by that one pretty quick, but it's the one that gives me the most concern, because I feel like this conversation so far is headed toward, we've got good water rights on paper, we've got good supply, so we've got good wet water supply. We're kind of all set. We might not need to do anything major to prepare for a future with less, water in the rivers and all that. But then just somebody walk us through this, please, because if I am reading it correctly, the dark blue line kind of caps out in a drought year well below what our demand will be. And I'm also a little bit confused about the shady lines that say future 2040 demand and how those differ from the bars on the left of them, the purple. So if somebody can just walk us through this and tell us why we shouldn't be concerned that that blue line looks like we can only supply half the water we're going to need 3 months of the year in a drought.
I will take a stab at that, and for goodness sake, if anybody has anything to add, remember Scott Pfeiffer came up with this, and he is the kind of consummate expert. The future 24 demand that you referenced, Ben, I believe is taken out of a planning document that I would say probably maybe not way, overestimated the growth that we would see here, but that number came out of one of our planning documents. I assume what you're looking at is the 2.5 versus the 11.25.
Well, sort of. I mean, really, I understand that the 11.25 are paper rights, and I get that, and that we don't have the physical infrastructure to supply all of that. But what concerns me is that the 2.5 looks like it's our total physical supply in a drought year, and it doesn't cover our demand, even without the future 2040 demand bar. And I think what we're talking about is, do we have enough water for our growth projections? So I do want to kind of trust some of that forecasting.
So I would say two things here. It appears to me that the total physical supply may not necessarily reflect calls on the river. It's in this scenario where it says water system and pipeline, that's Nettle Creek.
Mhm.
And so as we saw in 2018, that can be called out, but we also implemented the pump back system that we're still trying to get in the ground, but that will address the users up there. As I mentioned with one of Chris's first questions, we didn't have to place a call on the Carbondale ditch or the Rockford ditch in 2018 because of the fact that we had return flows that were providing water coming into the system so we could continue to divert there. I would argue, and this is why I'm looking to my left, that if we needed to, I'm going to say in the majority of scenarios, place a call on that from the Carbondale, the Bowles and Holland, the Rockford, that would free up water to be physically available for us to use.
Go ahead,
Correct
Mark.
me if I'm wrong, but we've got as a backup also additional well field capacity that I don't think is reflected in that.
Well, I
It's
think
not developed today.
I think we're talking about the difference between physical water availability versus water rights. I know this isn't doing a good job of explaining this, Ben, but I didn't put this together, so I don't know the impetus behind it. My strong feeling is that with our water rights portfolio, we could make physical water available even in this scenario. And, you're looking at projections too.
Mhm.
If you look at some of the charts that I did, with that 1.2 to 1.4 million gallon a day demand during irrigation season, that's less than 2.5 CFS. So I wouldn't, I don't know that the projections maybe reflect what we're actually seeing on the ground with lower consumption as well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just felt like that one was worth spending a moment on.
This is the kind of example of a water planning exercise and document that just needs to be continually updated. You know, these questions can't just be asked once and put aside. That's a great question to raise. I wish I could remember what Scott Pfeiffer had told me in 2018 when he prepared this, like I did the other one. I would also add to what Kevin said, that this assumes zero flow from Meadow Creek, which is possible because of the call Kevin mentioned. But in the past, even in droughts, we've typically been able to use, there is physical water there. There's wet, Susan's wet water is there. The question is it called out? And typically there's, I think 0.8 CFS, maybe something like that up there. Is that about right? So if that was added in, we would be have another margin there to answer Ben's question. And then as Mark pointed out, the Roaring Fork well field is by no means maxed legally or physically. And the Roaring Fork, obviously, as a source, is just limited by how much money and pipeline we are willing to, put in. That source can be developed and increased. And one of the reasons the Rudai water was purchased is it backs up that source if we ever need to go above our historic water rights. And so anyway, but it's a good question to ask. And next time we talk to Scott, we'll have him remind us what he meant.
Right. Well,
The other thing I would add is, if I can get there, he had a footnote in this that talked, where'd you go?
just down a little bit. Yeah.
There we go. About the additional 2.97 CFS that can be converted from the Carbondale ditch through our municipal system. So the way he has that footnoted, I would think you could probably add that to the 2.55. And then you're talking 4 or 5 million gallons a day.
If you
Yeah.
can put an intake and treat it, obviously.
So maybe this is one of those things that we do ask where we update, because it is useful to look at. But this was, I mean, I'm looking at my packet from 2018 and it's the same chart because I had nice color printed copies. And so, yeah, I think we did put things in place because we had that discussion in 2018 that may have even changed this. And then we've since had the census and we might have some updated kind of growth numbers that he could use. Because I think this is useful, but maybe it just needs to be updated with our more current situation. Maybe that can be part of our action items, Lonnie. All right. If there's no more questions on this part, Lonnie, do you want to take us through yours or?
I'll just go through relatively quickly in the last 20 minutes here. And just to note that the blocked in areas at the heading that you see on top of each section are actually thoughts that came from Mayor Ben and at the time Heather Henry, who started this project about a year ago. And I used this outline and kind of expanded upon it to get us where we are today with answering some of the questions that were left open-ended last year. So the first one, with the goals. So it's just a regional overview of what's happening here. So we'll take it down from regional to local. You've all read the articles, I'm sure, but the key takeaway from this first page is the graph that shows us how quickly the peak runoff has come about in May rather than in normally June. And the significance of that are two things. Number one, why did it happen more quickly? And that's because of the aridification and the dust that fell on Sopris and other high mountain areas that caused the rapid melt of the snow and sent it down more quickly. And therefore it'll leave us with less flow during the time frames that we most need the water at the end of the season, or the summer, I should say, when it's the hottest. So that is an area of concern, and that's directly attributable to the climate variations that we're experiencing now. You can also see in this other image the flows that peaked for the season on May 20th. And here we are in July, and my industry just got called out of the water because of the heat. So that's going to be a foreshortened recreational fishing season for us as a consequence. Okay, so the next one for the work session, which was moved exactly roughly a year back, was the legal discussion that Mark Hamilton did a really nice job of with Susan as well. So I don't think there are any other questions about, the water rights, the prioritization, the calls, and the process that goes into that in water court, I don't believe. I think that was very well covered and left me at least feeling confident that we're well looked after and that our supplies won't dwindle in the near future. The other one then, I think, when the top of the next page, when the crystal begins dropping at the rate of 2 to 3 CFS a day, that's when we start to worry a little bit, but that hasn't happened yet. May or may not, we just don't know. And that's above Redstone, which is above us. The next outlined heading is to determine the role of the ditch system. And Kevin did a nice job describing that as well. So I think we are pretty clear on what the role of the ditch system is, to develop some redundancy, also to give access to raw water for those who are close enough to a ditch to be able to pull it directly out for irrigation purposes. But interestingly, the bar graph below, you can see that using the crystal as an example, what the town rights are as opposed to other rights in the upper Crystal Valley is relatively modest. It's pretty darn small. So when, people approach us as trustees and staff and talk to each other about how much water we're using, we have to keep in mind that we're at the lower end of that system. And what we are actually using is very modest and compared to what the river actually produces on a year-over-year basis from natural flows. I also entered or included some diagrams of what a water treatment plant looks like, generally to give the public an idea of what actually goes into delivering the water to us. It's not like we're pulling water directly out of a river system or a stream system and transporting it to our faucets. There's a lot of steps that are required in order to get it to potability standards so that we can use it indoors and clean it up so that it's usable outdoors as well. I think the Rockford ditch was very well described and is another question that we often hear because it's so highly visible that the town sometimes gets confused about whether this belongs to us, whether we're responsible for it, and why is there so much water in there during a hot year. But as we've learned through this exercise, the town doesn't control that, right? We're obligated to provide it to a downstream user. And by state statute, it just happens to run through our geography. The next outlined high point was to take a look at what other towns are doing. And Cortez was called out as one to pay particular attention to because it's been published a lot lately in the relevant journals and so forth. So I did a little outline here of the differences between Cortez and Carbondale, just to give us an idea of some of the other geographical locations that we hear about, but it's best to understand that even though there are similarities, it's very easy to see that there are some distinct differences based on where they're located in a high plateau desert versus our riparian mountain valley as an example, the differences in temperatures during sustained unseasonable highs, the differences in primary water source. So theirs is from contract water in the McPhee Reservoir, and ours is from Nettle Creek. So that's how their population is supplied, and their supplemental water sources are quite different as well. And then the population itself is varied. So it seems like a lot of the work that they're doing that we've been hearing about are operational improvements, perhaps based on some deferred maintenance that needed to be taken care of. But that's why we're seeing some progress within their municipality that perhaps we can take a look at as examples, but it's best to understand the reasons why these are occurring. And I'm not going to go down that list. Everybody can read it. The other thing that's been a little bit confusing to the masses are the confusion between weather and climate, right? So climate takes a long range view of the last 30 years roughly, and we've got a good sense of what's been going on over the last 20 based on how many drought seasons we've seen, how low the crystal has been from 2002 to today, to this year. So, you know, it's the canary in the mine shaft, right? So we're seeing that there are some changes taking place. But to remember that when you're looking at the weather forecast for the day or for the week, that's different. You know, just because it's happens to be raining today doesn't mean that we're out of the woods by any means. We have to take a longer range view. And so it's important for the public to understand that, as well as, you know, we keeping that in mind as a driver to whatever conclusion we arrive at. Then next highlight was to gather data on the biggest water users in our municipality. And I did meet with RVR, and I don't think we have a representative here, but you know, they haven't really done a lot to address water usage. I won't say consumption because that's a different terminology, right? So water use. But some of the improvements or changes they've made to their declarations have more to do with the master design guidelines around landscaping. So around trees and other kinds of vegetation that are acceptable to use. And then with an eye on clearing some of the old growth, both for fire mitigation and as well as just getting rid of it because it's damaging to some of the hardscapes. So those are the only two things that have happened in the last 8 years. There are some challenges, and there are certain segments of that development that regulate their own water use that the HOA has really no control over. And then there are segments of that development that the HOA does control the water as far as irrigation is concerned. So there's some variations within the development. And then they do have a little water district that was established in roughly 2016-ish between the golf course and the HOA, which are totally separate entities. They're both their own individual enterprise entities, and they did so to account for the cost of each individual's water that's on a shared system. So those are some of the intricacies that happen in that area of consumptive use. And then the other one that was suggested was the school district, and I still need to follow up on that. I don't have a good contact person for the outdoor property management, so I'll figure that out still. Next, we get to gather data sets or gather data and set targets for per capita water use. And I went through some of our neighbors' water conservation plans, and they were pretty easy to read through because the same consultant does it for everybody. So once you go through one, it's easy to find the information that you're looking for. But as Kevin mentioned, there are different methods of accounting for per capita usage, right? So some of them don't separate outdoor and indoor use, and others have variations in population based on tourism and other things that might skew the numbers a little bit. So everybody's doing the best they can, but these are the numbers that popped out in this first round of investigation. And you can see that based on what we see from Basalt and Glenwood and so forth, we're doing a pretty good job here in Carbondale based on the 46 GPD per person roughly. And then it was suggested that we get some more expertise into the conversation, and that's why a number of folks that we see in our audience are with us today, and as well perhaps on Zoom that couldn't be here. I understand that July, August is a very heavy meeting time, and some folks were already obligated and so couldn't join us, but are certainly available for anything that we might ask of them, and specifically chose folks who had a water affinity or expertise and are also Carbondale residents. So they could also provide this perspective of what they might feel the community would be amenable to based on what they see. So in conclusion, you know, based on the numbers that Mark shared or Kevin shared earlier that we all talked about, the Carbondale residents have done a commendable job, I think, of cutting back on irrigation. There's a lot of sensitivity to water use and the state of the rivers here because we're all ecologically sensitive, I think, because we live in the environment and we're currently constantly exposed to it, unlike folks on the Front Range perhaps, or on the East Coast. So that on our own, we've done a pretty darn good job. So the question then becomes, as characterized as an ecosystem, which, you know, I do believe that because, and Kevin and I have talked about this, because of our geographical location in the upper elevation of the watershed, right, with multiple sources available, a significant portion of which is returned to recharge the system, which causes me to characterize what we have as a natural ecosystem. What can our community then do to assist it in remaining sustainable and making it a little bit more resilient based on the information that we've heard this evening? So that would be the final conclusion that I would offer. And then there were a couple of goals that I'd just thrown in here at the very end, what individuals might do. So the first goal, of course, is for us as a board of trustees to fully understand the regional climate implications and legal associations to guide locally responsible and actionable water initiatives. And then reach agreement between the board and staff about our water management, which sounds like it's pretty darn solid based on all the redundancies that we've seen and following the VCAP study that Heather sponsored in 2018 as a guideline as well. And then, you know, what can we prepare for our consumers or our constituents to look to so that they can then be participating in this effort to reduce water consumption in years that are of high heat and aridification. So I'll close with that and turn it back over for any other discussion or questions and answers of any of our panel members.
All right. Thanks, Lonnie. Yep, this was also very thorough. This was a very cool packet. I'll be printing this one too, putting my water binder. So there's some goals you articulated here. I made a few notes for things that came up earlier as well. But we have audience members and there might be some folks online who I'd love to open it up to and see if you want to, if anyone would like to come up to the mic and share any ideas, thoughts, recommendations you have for us, or how I know some folks contributed or, you know, have talked to Lonnie through this process. So we'd love to hear from you. It's a work session, so it's pretty informal, although I will ask that maybe you keep it somewhat limited in time. So, and I hope everybody's okay. We are going to go over time. We had scheduled this to 7:30, but we're on a roll. Okay. Okay. If you can just share your name and where you live, doesn't have to give the address, but. Okay.
Kate Collins, and I'm a Carbondale resident, and I wrote to everybody last year because I have been in Westminster where my family lives, and they have a sod removal program that was brilliant, where they would go in, remove sod in the yard, and then a legitimate landscape designer would create a plan, spec in xeric plants and mulch, and then they would deliver all that to the homeowner, and they would.
Hey, could you make sure the mic is on up there? Sorry, or do we know? Okay.
Am I not talking loudly? They won't hear you on Zoom.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, let me just- Better?
You folks here are on Zoom?
No, that mic just doesn't seem to be working.
I know.
All righty.
There we go.
So I just wanted to present that idea, and it, of course, the big question is, well, how would we afford that? How could we execute on that? And to me, I thought about some GoCo money. There's a provision in there for healthy rivers and streams. And so that might be a potential funding source for something like that. And then I know there's a lot of things percolating at a state level for incentives for people to eliminate turf. I personally, the whole water rights discussion was really informative for me. I like to say that I don't know what I don't know about water rights. So I learned a lot, but it seems kind of bleak in that if we save it, we still can't send it on down to the 7 states or 6 other states that live on the water from the Colorado River. So to me, obviously we have to do what we can locally and regionally, but it's a bigger discussion too about, how do we change water law, existing water law that just appears to not really make sense moving on into the next few decades. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And thanks for sending your idea. And again, I feel like I dropped the ball replying to you last year and meeting with you. All right. All right. Would anyone else like to talk to us? We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, come on up.
Hey, I'm not a Carbondale resident, but my name is April Long. Thanks for inviting me. I am the executive director of the Root Eye Water and Power Authority. Lonnie Kitching is your representative on my board. So I just want to commend Carbondale for talking about this. This is wonderful. You have outstanding water attorneys on your team and outstanding staff. So great job with all of that and for making progress. And Lonnie, including that information about how your residents are maintaining their levels is really important and commendable. A couple of things that people talked about that I just made some notes about. So when you're thinking about, do you have enough water to grow as a city? I think that obviously you do, you have plenty of water rights and water supply. But I think it's important to also remember that that's a trade-off. So where does that water come from? While it might not come from your neighbor, it would come from the river. And so always thinking about that piece of the trade-off of, do we want to take more water out of the Crystal, more water out of the Roaring Fork, is an important note to make. Mark, one of the things you mentioned and people have discussed and you were just talking about as well, is there a way to return water to the river in a way that it does not get absorbed by the next junior water user downstream? And I wondered if Carbondale has considered any of the non-diversion agreements or any Colorado Water Trust agreements where you could, in times of drought, contribute water to the river and it be held and shepherded. And I didn't know if Carbondale has looked into any of those options.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If that's okay.
We've over the years, certainly there's been meetings with the Water Trust. Those programs have been made available to not just Carbondale, but everyone in the Crystal, as you know. I guess no, the short answer is no. I don't think the town has pursued either of the two options you identify. But a non-diversion agreement is a form of what I think I referred to, meaning that somebody agrees not to divert, but there's no legal protection of the water once it gets past the head gate. So that is what I was talking about. The other thing that she's talking about, though, would be that there are other programs where you can sell, lease on a temporary basis or otherwise water that is not immediately needed to go to the in-stream flow program. It's basically a lease to the state. There's a variety of them, different terms and conditions. But one thing that's common among them is that in order to be a meaningful, usable lease, there has to be a decrease in water use, so that they do look either at the court level or at the administrative level at how much in irrigation is the usual example. So if there was 100 acres irrigated and you want to lease 10% of your water to the in-stream flow program, you generally would need to dry up 10% of your irrigation. So it comes with the dry up obligation. But if the dry up obligation can be met, that is a vehicle that's available.
Yeah, so I would just encourage Carbondale to be thinking about those out of the box solutions like that when you're thinking about the Crystal River particularly. And then the turf program that she was speaking of, I just wanted to remind you that legislation was passed in Colorado this year for a turf buyback program. And so there is money dedicated for that program to the CWCB to give to municipalities that implement a program like that so that you can pay residents to decrease their turf. So that's, a great place to start on things like that. And I love Lonnie's goals for looking at the goals that she presented for looking at turf replacement programs, as well as limiting or budgeting how much turf or water use is used in the backyard, those kinds of things. So just wanted to encourage you all to move in that direction. While Carbondale is water secure, the West is not. We are in a drought and we should begin to look like we're in a drought. So it would be great to be collecting data that shows that water per capita is trending down. And especially as Carbondale is growing, making sure that, if you can set goals and programs to encourage that water use to trend down. So, and as RWAPA staff, happy to help in whatever ways that I can and provide assistance to your staff or to this trustee commission. I'm used to saying counselor commission, trustee board. Whenever necessary, I'm happy to provide any information about what's happening in the watershed. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, April. Those are really good questions and things to add to our list. I have a follow-up question on that, on the lease program, Mark or Susan. Is it a permanent lease, or is it where during a year of drought or during a 1-year kind of lease program where it's like, all right, we're feeling pretty good this year, we could lease 10% of our usage?
There's a variety of vehicles. They include, it could be a permanent thing. You could actually sell water to the state if you chose, and that would be just like selling a house. It's gone. So that's not a lease. There are long-term leases that can be done. Those have to be approved by the water court, like a change of water right that I described. There are short-term leases where the CWCB it's not generally arrangement where the statute says that they can use the water for in-stream flows in 3 of 10 years. So they try to, I think that's somebody saying 3 out of 10 are going to be the dry years. And so they try to use the water then, and then the town could, or the town's residents could use it in the other 7 years. The other types of agreements are more like the non-diversion agreement that April and I were talking about, where it's the city of Aspen's done that on one of their ditches that is not a huge piece of their water system, but they agreed to leave some water in the critical dry reach that goes through the park up there by the rugby field.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Because I think that gets to kind of what Kate had brought up as well, is if we were going to save water, is there a way to try and make sure it stays in the river and not thrown on the next hayfield?
Yeah, I'm just saying when we just reduce, that there's other people, and that's true downstream too. I mean, there's ditches in Grand Junction and Glenwood, and it's all
Yeah.
a connected system.
Yeah.
And the state's the only one that's allowed to protect water for in-stream environmental uses. The towns and counties now can do RICDs, but those are recreational uses, and the statutes kind of say kayaking is different than fish.
Right.
They're not the same use.
Okay. Great clarification on that. Anyone else? The other two left, so you two. All right, Ben or Luis, did you want to chime in on anything, or is there anybody else online who wants to raise their hand and speak? Nope. All right.
I can jump in for a sec if nobody else was. I mean, I just to kind of start getting us toward moving on, our goal was to really identify sort of how stable and secure our water rights for the growth that we're experiencing and that we project, and that seems to be very good. And then should we do anything to reduce demand? And it sounds like, and I appreciate what April Long was just sharing, it sounds like this is something we don't have to do, but something that we probably should do because it's the right thing to do, to not sort of, use more water than we really need to. And so one of the main things that I'm thinking as a next step is just asking staff to consider bringing us some efficiency measures in the future. I mean, both from Parks and Rec, and I know that we did a lot of work there in the 2018 drought. But going forward about how can we reduce our own water use and kind of set a good example around town on our own properties. And then as well as I think from the utilities department, if we're looking at needing to increase supply to meet a future summer demand peak, like on that one graph we focused on for a while, I'd love to see an alternative to that. If it's going to cost us $500,000 to add a new well, and we think we're going to mostly need it for those peak 3 months of outdoor irrigation, what if we spent that $500,000 on, a turf buyback and some efficiency measures and things like that? So, I'm not suggesting that that's the answer, that could actually work perfectly or anything, but I'm not feeling like we need to spend a ton more time on this at the board level right now, but I'm feeling like at the staff level, when things come up and we're going to, do a new infrastructure improvement or a new park or we're redoing an irrigation system, anything like that. And I think we already do, but let's just really make it a priority on, can we do that through efficiency? Can we meet those needs rather than through increasing supply?
Thanks, Ben. Chris had something.
Is there distinctions made legally between different types of beneficial use? So like I don't know, does an agricultural use versus a municipal use or something? I guess what I'm trying to drill down to is, if we put our water to use in a way that is maybe more officially defensible as beneficial use, which I guess I would think maybe, in my opinion, would be food production, maybe be the most defensible.
I'd be interested to hear my colleague's take on this, so I'll give her half the time here. But my answer would be that in my experience, although there's some very arcane language in the Constitution that suggests maybe there's a hierarchy of uses, that in reality, I don't think there is one. I think that irrigation, municipal, domestic, recreation, all these things we've been talking about are treated no better or worse than the others. It's just simply of who has the date during the time of shortage, who has the earliest court date.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think, besides that arcane language that Mark just mentioned, that's the only suggestion we see in the statutes about putting certain types of beneficial uses before others. And I think they're designed that way. I think the whole idea is that the needs of the state change with time. So I think the legislature very intentionally doesn't define a hierarchy of beneficial uses to let the water users and the people in the state actually define what they think is beneficial.
Mm-hmm. But Chris, once water is in the town system under a municipal water right, that's a pretty broad umbrella. It can include everything from growing food to flushing toilets. And so if the town wants to prioritize or incentivize one type of use over another, it can do so through rates, through regulations. Mm-hmm. There are opportunities once it's within the system. But what my answer had to do with on the rivers or in a drought, does the state favor agriculture over municipal or vice versa? The answer is no.
Mm-hmm. And so you have 10 years if you're haven't put it to use before somebody can challenge you, I guess, is that the?
It's usually the state itself that keeps a running list, and then they file a list that's published and everybody can look at it and say, no, I used my ditch last year. You just didn't notice. There's a chance to have that discussion, but the state's generally the one, although there are circumstances when in water court, either a party initiates a claim for abandonment or somebody raises it in defense of a case. Private parties can do that against each other.
Because I've always been curious, like just specifically down there around the CMC turnoff, it seems like there's been a development underway since the mid-90s where they haven't irrigated any of those fields.
That's a great question. I'm not familiar with the history. I know exactly the field you're talking about behind the old restaurant there, but I don't know what that legal source is or what its status is today. But in theory, if a ditch doesn't water a big piece of land for 10, 20, 30 years, there's a process for that water right to be terminated.
And then I guess, I know we went to court in the 2000s around water quality. Seems like we've established the quantity is pretty well, seems pretty secure. But obviously people always worry about water quality, and is there program, are there any things in place to, I guess, communicate with homeowners who are near our water sources and or legal frameworks? I know that we sort of set precedent, I think, in that last case in terms of protecting our water supply against the one homeowner above our system who was using herbicides that were not ideal. And I don't know if we've done any more work in that realm, if that's important, or what people think of that.
Very familiar with that case. Caused a lot of sleepless years. For those, the basis of that case and the basis of the town's water quality rights are an old statute that says that even if you're outside town boundaries, that municipalities in Colorado, it's towns only, interestingly, not counties, municipalities can establish water quality protections within 5 miles above their intakes. And so we have an ordinance on the books in Carbondale that says, thou shalt not pollute water within 5 miles of our sources. Our sources are Nettle Creek, the Crystal Wells, the Roaring Fork Wells are the main, it's drinking water sources, not ditches. And so we have an ordinance that says you may not pollute. So up the Roaring Fork 5 miles from the wells, or up the Crystal, 5 miles above the Crystal Wells. Imagine the circles kind of being drawn, pie pieces. We filed a map with the state that reflects those watershed protection boundaries. The only known instance I know of enforcement, other than dialogue with landowners once in a while, was the lawsuit that resulted in that Supreme Court case, which was the use of herbicides on that ranch above the Nettle Creek Springs. But that's a tool we have, but we haven't. Some towns have implemented very, very detailed regulations and permit systems. So if somebody, for instance, wanted to put in a septic tank above on the banks of the Roaring Fork, up towards Catherine's Store, if that's what's, I don't even know if that's within 5 miles, but I think it is. So, in theory, we could have a permit system. Rifle has one actually on its watershed. We have never had a permit system. We just have an ordinance that says don't pollute. So if we thought there was an issue, we have legal grounds like we did in that case to bring a case, but we don't have people coming to us saying, I want to dig, I want to drill a well, I want to put in a gas station or whatever. We could do that, but it's a additional regulatory step we've never taken.
But that is something you generally keep an eye on, I guess, of what's happening development wise in these radius areas, or communicate, I don't know, it doesn't have to be regulatorily, but friendly, in a friendly manner of like, this is your responsibility as living in this zone.
We also have to factor in, Chris, that especially on the Roaring Fork, the filtration system that's there, that, from biological contaminants, for instance, that would be the type of contaminant that would come out of a septic tank. It's perfectly capable of treating that, just like Rifle treats water that comes from us and we treat water that comes from Aspen. That's the way the system works. And so while we could use it to regulate pollution, it's always been my view that we should only do so if the pollution was going to be a material impact to us, something we couldn't remove. And the herbicides are something that we cannot, those inorganic compounds we can't remove. That was my understanding.
Mark, did you want to respond to Mark Amir? The great question.
We do very rigorous testing protocol on the domestic water supply. So we have a good foundation for what's normal. And if we get a spike, which I've never seen, the case that you were talking about was before my day, but that would show up on the regulated contaminant list that we regularly test for with the state of Colorado and the EPA.
And if we got a spike like that, we would investigate, what's the potential source. Last couple of years, we've also been taking a few samples out of the ditches and nothing herbicide wise has shown up in those either. So while it's not a direct correlation to our drinking water, it's still connected to it. So if we saw it in the ditch, it would probably trigger something as well.
Yeah. Great. Well, those are great replies. And then I guess, what else did I had some other notes here? Sorry, trying to. Do we have like a inventory of who's on the ditch versus who's on the municipal water for outdoor use, or is that mapped in any way?
I do have a list of ditch users. It's not 100%. We've got a pretty good idea who's on the ditches, who's not. I've got an address list that's gone back several years. And there's been some people that have tied on to the ditches, I'm going to say within the past 3 years, that we haven't updated that list. But we've got a list for the Carbondale, the Weaver, and then there's a kind of a mixed list that's part Carbondale, part Weaver, depending on where they are. And we do have that.
So is generally the policy, if you're willing to pay the cost of getting to the ditch from your property, you can tap into it, or how do we decide whether residents have that right or not to?
It's available to all the residences of Carbondale. I generally request a plan so that they're not just putting something in the ditch that's going to interfere with the operation of the ditch, and also so that their installation is prepared for low water in the ditch during drought years when the ditches run relatively low, and usually the latter part of the season. And eventually it's possible through some of the graphic interfaces that we could come up with square footage of gardens and things like that pretty easily. I've not done that. I've got a list of all the large landscapes, the parks, the highway, school district. I've got a pretty good list of the acreage on that. And that's probably the predominant use of the ditch water right now.
Is the parks and highways, you said?
And schools.
The school district, parks, and the highway corridor.
Highway corridor, yeah. Interesting, yeah. I guess so, yeah, I would just be, I was just brainstorming and thinking if we are getting into a position where we feel pinched, maybe one thing to explore is are there sections of town that could be somehow connected to the ditch system so they can use raw water as opposed to potable water? Or if, anywhere that's easy, if that's easy to do, or technically or not.
I can tell Mark and I are totally interested in that happening in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, 3 of us. Easier said than done.
Totally easier said than done.
Yeah, I imagine, but I guess if you're talking about major $1 million improvements of one sort of another, maybe this falls in the same category as drilling a new well or something like that.
Right, that's a good point.
So for an example, it wasn't a large scale thing, but when we redid 3rd Street, we actually brought those ditches across so there was more direct access for the folks on the west side. So I think good opportunities would come kind of in conjunction with other work that's going on. But we did do that in 2017, I think.
Anyway, that's just seemed like something you might want to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Going forward.
Colin? You done?
There, I do remember, I seem to remember, might have been 20 years ago, there was a proposal to expand the ditch system and it failed. But that was the idea. Neighborhoods like mine, yours, we don't have access to it. But it failed. So in terms of next steps, I'm really interested in Scott's update of that chart. I'm also really interested in his footnote of some of the acre feet in the Carbondale ditch could be moved over to municipal use if needed. And I would just love to, like, there's probably huge technological problems with that because it's ditch water. So it'd probably have to be cleaned and treated and all kinds of things, but it'd be really interesting to know what's related to that. This has been really, really interesting information and I think we're in a really great position, but there's no way we can predict what's going to happen with climate change. I think we can assume that we're going to have less water. We're already underwater. I mean, we don't have as much water as we think we do. And I just would encourage us to try and figure different ways that we can prepare for that. In terms of uses, since water law is the way it is, you kind of use it or lose it. I'd be really interesting though in using it more effectively. And we have a lot of big fields that just get sprayed and then we just cut them. And we're having a hard time staffing the cutting. And I often wonder if we might also think about shifting some of that water so we can get more street trees, more trees for cooling. City Market, we paved a lot of that area. There is some landscaping, but there's really no trees. And just finding ways to make sure we're trying to cool our urban landscape as much as possible, and reducing some of our turf might be a way of doing that without compromising the system, given the way it's set up. Because I mean, I live in a neighborhood that no street trees were planted, so, and it's a wide street, so it cooks in the summer. And it took 20 years to grow some decent trees, and it'd be great to have that be an active program as we move forward.
Great. I've captured a list of what's come up as ideas. So I'll just go through those really quick, but then maybe I'll hand them off to you, Lonnie, to incorporate into this or build from it. That sound good? So I just have same thing. I have the figure 2 for planning purposes, seeing if we can get this updated. So it's the analysis of legal and physical water supplies. And then part of that kind of builds on it is maybe we work towards setting a goal of reducing per capita usage annually, or like our neighboring by a certain date, kind of like a carbon goal or a carbon emission reductions goal. I made a couple scribbles based on Chris and Colin's notes to staff, but maybe it's part of, and also what Ben said is when we're starting to look at adding more water, so maybe if it is drilling another well, maybe we look at that compared to, could we instead add ditch access or reduce other demand in some other way, just so that we're evaluating that across, I guess, the best bang for our buck if we're going to put money somewhere. And so maybe that becomes part of future analysis, because really this is going to go beyond this board as well. And so what can we put in place that helps future boards or future staff make those decisions? Lonnie had on the goal 4 those guidelines for turf, and maybe it expands onto what Colin was just saying, where it's even so much like, what do we recommend, but what can we do to our existing turf? What can we do along the highways to reduce water usage or reduce our mowing if we are having a problem staffing it? I'm okay with long grass along our highways. I have it all over my yard. And then let's see, setting out the turf buyback program, I guess, might be in somewhere in that comparison, of seeing if we could implement that. I think adding to our tools is considering or diving a little bit more into this leasing water. At least that's what I made a note of. Is that something that we want to set a goal for if we're reducing usage, that we make it a goal to try and get more water and lease it to the in-stream program specifically? And then I had brought up an FAQ. I do want to, we're going to have impacts, but I would love to see an easy guide for our citizens of like, hey, look what we have in place, and really highlighting. I feel like our staff have been incredible and done a lot of work to help us be water secure, even if it's going to go down in the future in general. And then I would love to also highlight our water quality, and this gets to the plastics reduction that we talk about. And so I had made a note of that and forgot to bring it up, but was reminded when Chris started talking about quality. Our water is amazing. And so I have a story for you guys. My daughter takes a giant jug of water to soccer practices. And now her teammates, she plays on a team with girls from Aspen to Glenwood. They refer to our water as Molly water because it's so good. They all fight over her water bottle. And I'm like, well, that's the town of Carbondale's water. and it's not out of any extra filtration in my house. So I just think our water is awesome. And so it'd be great to make sure people know that. And whether that's, I think that's in our future communications work. I don't want to throw that on you guys right now, but I just think we have a lot to brag about in both our quality and kind of the security that we're at right now, and then our plans to go forward. So I'll copy the sheet. Anything else I missed?
Well, you didn't miss anything, but
Yeah.
quickly on that, you guys publish an annual chart on our water, right? It's in the paper every year. But this would be something that when the water and sewer bill, and trash bill goes out, this would be where you put an insert. You know, this is what we used 10 years ago. This is what we use now.
Mhm.
Keep it up.
Yeah,
Something.
I think so too. Because and I think bragging about our reduced usage over time and letting people know it's like, way to go. Yeah, keep it up. Let's keep doing it. So that was a lot of
I
things.
guess
I
I have
threw in
one
there.
last, sorry.
Yes, what did I
last
miss?
thing. No, I didn't bring it up. But I guess whether we have improved procedures in place to avoid, I know we had sort of a plastic spill of our own. When was that, in 2012 or something? We had a flooding event with our intake in Nettle Creek. And I don't know if we have procedures to avoid that from happening again, or similar things like that.
That was not fun.
All right. Anything else? Or Ben, did you want to add anything else to wrap us up?
No, thanks. I think that's a good list, and I think we can start taking those next steps. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else have anything to add? Yeah.
So Kevin, you mentioned something about our pipe size, and it's referenced here. And I think you said there's some areas in town with the pipes being kind of inadequate and need to be made larger. Is that something that you guys are just putting in budget to do over time? Or is that something that we need to be more aware about in terms of trying to set some money aside? Or
So my point was that if we tried to do the amount of irrigation that is currently combined between the potable system and the raw water system,
okay,
we would have to
Okay.
enlarge the
Okay,
pipes.
but
It's
we-
not.
but we don't have to. Okay, great.
We have the ability to distribute.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Colin. All right, it is 8 o'clock. We're starting our housing item. Do we need to take a quick break?
Yes.
Okay. What is it? 7 minutes seems to be our magic number. 7-minute break.
Okay, Lonnie, thank you. Thank
Okay.
you for your work.
We'll be back at 8:08.
My pleasure.
You are designated for
One
this
master.
work.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
I am too. That's why I'm like.
Thank you.
Sue.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, we had to like shuffle rooms.
No,
that's okay.
Go over there,
Yeah,
go over
okay.
there. No, go over there.
Okay. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that was- Well, usually you text me, so I was like.
Yeah, it was in traffic. I was
Recreational, which is what's in the contract. Would Carbondale be interested in using?
That's great. I just wanted
Yeah,
to check.
I'm not getting that.
Polymers of Blue Dye water in order to improve features.
Yeah, nice to meet you, I'm Susan.
So you missed
Right.
my announcement of our little.
Yeah, it's
not.
Right. But I know it has to go through you, so, yeah. Okay.
My reaction is subjective.
Known drug user. And we emptied his pocket.
Just need this year.
He had a full syringe, which they successfully avoided, and then he had
Okay.
some other things they had never
Okay.
saw before, but it ended up
I'm
being
working with the Bureau right now.
some sort of vaping liquid.
I'm going to, you're the first one I
Stored
talked to.
inside a
Okay.
disassembled liquid.
Yeah, and I don't know if the lower.
And so it made,
How much of this is? That's what I knew.
oh my God. Yeah, so it made. Bill. And sex, and it also made they had sex. And while I had evidence, she was in. So.
Yeah.
Fire department here.
Yeah, so I mean,
Building.
together,
All the
yeah.
DA, they
But I'm
came
thinking
up
if we
with
combine
everything.
efforts, we could get, you know,
And
50
buildings
events.
open and stuff. It's fine now, but Shehan and Ben just got out of hospital.
I haven't
They
talked
were
to them
under
yet.
observation. They had like, their pulse rates were really high, they were flushed, they were sweating. Shehan- She is asthma.
I've seen.
Yeah.
Okay, is that? Okay, yeah, okay, I can talk to you.
Because people in
Yeah.
scientific studies.
Yeah, I live here.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah, I know.
Well, and,
So, yeah.
the first thing I said was fentanyl, and Kurt said, this was fentanyl, today we already down. But, apparently people are taking apart.
Right. I think the other downside is that
Which is
by
like,
pulling water out of Root Eye, you're lowering it.
how fast do you drink?
So that
Or,
maybe
you know,
that's-
why don't you just check with them? Well, expose yourself to this, but save us all trouble.
So anyway, it was some, it was a
Something
little
like that.
bit.
Okay, thank you.
Great job explaining. Yeah, it was a little crazy. I'm walking through the, I was outside and then I'm walking through the hallway. It was obviously saying, get your stuff, hang out back, get your stuff, hang out back. Do not expect to be hang out back. Like, what's going on, right, exactly. So, it was, right. Thank you. I don't think
Reading all that stuff, we seem to have this. And it wasn't referenced, not a big deal.
Yeah.
But it seems like it has a lot of stuff. It has a lot of the VCAP stuff in it too. But it could be that we could take this and start throwing the goals in. It says it's supposed to be updated every 7 years, 2015. So it might be that we don't have to do all that much, but we just
Sounds like everything's calm now.
Everything's calm. All our people are out of the hospital.
Oh,
Fine.
We're not gonna get into
Yeah, so at least you
uh,
text me, he's like, they won't let me in, but they told me they're about to discharge them. Cause he was gonna take Shay home.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, but, yeah, so. Crazy. Well, we were a little worried about her. I don't know if it's medical or our people were worried about her. She was scared about that.
Yeah, you're saying that.
Yeah, so,
Well, I'm glad she's okay.
yeah. So, just, you know, we're
All right,
we're
we're
making
7
the best
minutes.
of it. We're
Yeah.
deciding that that was a really,
What'd you
really
say?
good.
3 bites of my sandwich.
No harm. Now you know what to do.
That's
Okay.
exactly
Right.
because they moved
Of course.
This is very broad and general.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too.
Have a good night.
Get that
Thank
deadline.
you. Have a good night.
Yeah.
I know, right?
We've walked the neighborhood, my neighbors and I, we've been like, okay, could go here, could go here.
You ready?
Yeah, I was so bummed when that failed.
So it was a vote
Yeah.
or something?
There was a vote to expand the system. Because 70% are on it.
Yeah.
30% are not. Why not get those 30%?
Totally.
It was only a few million. Well, back then it was probably only a couple $1 million.
Right.
I would have to bucket the water over to my yard. There's just no good way to do it.
Well, and
I'm at the-
RVR, I mean, it started, but I don't think it was included in the package. It was the old part.
Oh, we lost everyone.
I'm
I know,
on
we're ready to
raw
get
water,
started.
At least anyway, but yeah, I mean, I did the tail end of the Carbondale ditch and I'd
Yeah, I
have to
know.
get a couple of buckets and walk
That's
across
right.
the street.
I thought you
Master-
brought it.
no, Master plan from Brent Simon.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
All right, should we get started?
Yeah.
So we have Andrea Stewart and Heather Henry here for this discussion. I don't know if we want to just make them panelists so they can chime in when they want.
Sure.
And on this one, I think we're just gonna have Colin kick it off and take us through it. That sound good?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I was asked to write this memo on housing to try and get us going on what I see as like an affordable housing or community housing plan. It's my understanding that the town does not have one. We do have statements related to the importance of affordable housing in our housing guidelines and in the adoption of the reasoning behind the adoption for the inclusionary zoning ordinance that was did, just after the turn of the century. The aughts, as people say. So it's always, the town and the town board has always supported affordable housing, but we've never really gotten it to the point that we have a plan for how to make it happen, other than we have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which, as good as that is entirely dependent on new development, right? So for anybody listening, if someone comes in with a development for 100 units, 20% have to be deed restricted. So to get 20 units, you have to build 100. So it's very, very useful. I think Glenwood's actually suffering the fact that they got rid of theirs and now they had to put it back in, but we've had it and we've generated some affordable housing because of it. So all good, but unfortunately not adequate to the challenge of creating more affordable housing. So this memo is kind of organized in 3 sections, kind of short-term, intermediate, and long-term, knowing that the whole lodging STR question is before us right now. So we don't want to stop that and create a plan. It's clear that that's part of our strategy for affordable housing. Then goes into things that I see taking 1 to 3 years to pull off, and they're mostly in suggestion form, and I'm sure you guys have your own thoughts of what we should include in that. And then there's the last one, which is kind of the big, it's like the Hail Mary to see if we can get that. I personally think the timing could be really good, but we'll get to that in a minute. So it also kind of includes some things that I think we'd have to have in a plan. So right off the bat, we document the scale and the challenge. We already have the regional housing study that shows that we have a gap on the lower end. It also shows that most of our housing that has been built is geared for people who make a lot of money. So the market is actually not meeting our needs. It's meeting the needs of very wealthy people. And if you just go to the MLS, which anybody can do online, and look at Carbondale, and some things are included in Carbondale that aren't in the town proper, but roughly there's about 100 units on the market right now in town, and only 6 are under $1 million. So we got a serious problem. The cheapest unit available in Carbondale right now is $565,000. You'd have to make $180,000 a year to afford that. If you use the rough rule of thumb, and you can afford 3 times what you make. Our AMI is probably a little over 85. That's Garfield County's. So the AMI in the county can afford a house of 255. We have a huge housing gap, which we all know, but we kind of need to document it. Fortunately, we've done a little bit of work on getting housing so we can list out all our housing. We've got 113 appreciation capped. 60 of those are in Thompson Corner, which came with the annexation of RVR. And then we've gotten a few over time through our inclusionary zoning ordinance. We do have senior units that are income capped. We have some rental units that are income capped. That includes Santa Lucia and the Red Hill Lofts. So about 90 of those. And they're all full, right? All the appreciation capped units are being occupied right now. As far as I know, there's only been one that's sold this year. So these things don't turn over. We have the rent capped units coming online, and then we have the town units. And I created really rough percentages for these things and threw out some example goals, because I think ultimately in our housing plan, we want to set some goals for ourselves. And then I translated those into rough numbers, right? So, but if we're building more units, our total housing units goes up. So all these numbers might change slightly.
Yeah, I really liked this. I'll just add in that I thought it was helpful to think of it like that. And thanks for putting in examples. Like, this is
Great.
what it could do.
This is what it could do.
Yeah.
And we just really we won't have a gauge of where we are unless we track these things and have some numerical goals. And I think that's kind of potentially our next step. So what would those goals be? What's the percentage of affordable housing do we want in the town? Do we want it to stay at 4? Do we want it to be 5? Do we want it to be 10? Different communities, Aspen in particular, has very specific goals. I think it'd be wise for us to try and get those figured out. I think that's another work session. Questions about how many town employee units do we have? Aspen wants to house 60% of their city workers in town. We can't do that. Not to say that we want to, but just as a way, as an example.
I think we house 40% of Aspen's employees.
Well,
That's 60% of their city staff.
Yeah.
Not employed.
City staff. Yeah. And I think putting together some of these goals could be really helpful in terms of making the case for a lodging / short-term rental tax going forward. Intermediate terms, and I didn't put it in here, but I think it'd be really useful to think of creating a small committee to help us with this. It's not only something that there's expertise in the community, but also depending on what we decide to do, they become potential advocates, because it's more than just us talking about this. And this is a pretty important topic in the community. So it'd be great to start thinking about including more people in the discussion. I think it's pretty, so I have some listed possible goals over the next 1 to 3 years, developing a conceptual plan for the town center site, and trying to get a sense of the financing of it. My understanding is that the more we want as a town on that site, the more we're going to have to put in. It's just, that's the way it goes. If we want more affordable housing for town staff, we're going to have to we're basically going to have to pay for it. So figuring out how that works, what we want, and how we're going to finance the project. I think that ties in potentially into funding for housing in general. So I think it would be really wise to start looking through all the different options we might have to finance affordable housing. We're looking at the SDR, and lodging taxes, unfortunately don't generate very much, and figuring out how we can get a dedicated funding source for affordable housing through other means. As a way of example, Basalt, they bonded their property tax and generated $6 million for affordable housing in Basalt.
Now buy 6 houses.
Buy down or help with, they're
Okay,
gonna,
yeah, no.
they're gonna do a lot of things.
I'm just saying that's not going to resolve the
It's
question.
not gonna resolve, but that's
A step.
money that they can start using way more than we have.
It's more than our short-term rental tax brings in.
Exactly. So I
We
mean,
can only work with what
trying
we
to
have.
trying to see what our various options are.
Yeah.
Because it's my understanding and my thinking is that we're going to have to ask for resources. So we need to know, what are we asking for? What's the amount, like who's it impact, and what's the case to be made for it? And potentially try and work our way into a question in November that deals with the town center site and potentially affordable housing in general.
Next November, you're saying?
Next November, 2023, sorry. At the earliest. I mean, it could take longer, but I think that'd be a good goal.
Great goal.
And, it'd be really useful to look about what Basalt's doing with their down payment assistance program, Vail, all this. Lauren has some ideas. If we can get some money through the SDR lodging tax fund, we could start doing some of this right now, which would be a great way to start buying down some units and helping people get into some units. It would also be really interesting to explore different communities have different policies. So residential development isn't the only impact for affordable housing. There's commercial development. There's a bunch of people who work at City Market. They were not included in any linkage, and there are commercial linkage fees that can be explored. The horse left the barn, so we can't do it retroactively. But exploring different ways that we can think about, are there different ways that we can get a little bit from everybody, because everybody's involved in this, instead of one lump sum from just one source. There's also the possibility, and this was explored in the past at the county level, of adding some fees. So anytime there's a land title fee, you have to pay, to do that. Record something related to land. You could add a fee at the county level, and we could generate some money that way. We'd have to talk with the county about that, but clearly something that, given the conversation we had when you met with them, I was online, there might be some interest. Who knows? The other one that I think we should continue with them is our trailer parks that are not necessarily in town are affordable housing stock right now, and they could easily vanish. So trying to figure out, given the legislation at the state level and the funding opportunities there, are there ways that we could start thinking about ways to help some of the residents purchase those? There was a great article in the paper, Colorado Sun, about the gypsum plan, and they came up with the money, but then the owner said no, because it wasn't a cash offer. So starting to figure out, are there things that we might be able to explore? Again, this is all part of potentially the plan, the larger plan. And then we now have the affordable housing regional effort. And it would really be interesting to start exploring, is there a way that we can create a regional financing mechanism or a bank of some sort that we could start doing things instead of all of us having to do it individually, because, you know, we're all pretty small. And then longer term goal, but I think it'd be worth us starting now, is talking to Bob Rankin and then whoever becomes our House rep after November, to see if they would support legislation to enable a RET. So everybody gets that it's in the Constitution and we're not allowed to do that. So it's a constitutional amendment. But if the legislature refers it, it's a lot easier than if we try and go around to all the different counties and get signatures. And, you know, Marty shared how he has friends in Colorado Springs. It's all over the state now. It's not just a mountain problem. And it connects the problem, appreciating housing crazy, with a potential solution. Like some people say, well, just pass a property tax. Well, yeah, but just it penalizes people who actually stay in their home.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas people who are just flipping things, which happens, they would pay that, and it's the buyer pays. So that's kind of that's the big kahuna. Aspen generated 22 million last year on that. We wouldn't get close to that, but we'd get enough that I think we could make a big impact on our housing. So
No, I was glad to see it on the list because I think it's time we can talk about it, but it's time to say, okay, let's make this happen.
great. So again, these are things we can include, we can add to. There's probably a few work sessions that we'd have to schedule some time to work through some of these things. Do they work? Do we want to do them? How do we pull them off? Do we have some resources to potentially get some professional help to do them? Some of this work potentially has already been done in some of the other communities. We might be able to tag team on what they're doing. And then ultimately, we end up with a plan that we can adopt that it doesn't have to be very long, you know, it can be 5 pages, but it has some goals, some objectives, and a list of things that we're going to try and accomplish over the next few years and set the goal for future boards as well.
Thanks, Colin. This was it was super helpful for me,
Great.
at least, to read through, and it helped trigger a couple ideas or
Great.
additions or things
Perfect.
to add to it.
That's the purpose.
So I just have a few things that I'd love to just add clarification or add to this on the documenting existing affordable housing. I think John Laybourne's kind of been doing this, but I think an assessment of, are they working? Like, are rules that put those in place working? Or are there loopholes that people have found, or that we need to, that we need to say, okay, well, that rule is in place, but let's adjust that policy because people are shirking it or whatever.
It's a great point. And it's almost like a longer intermediate goal because, for instance, I was involved in selling one of the units for my mother-in-law, and it's in Cedar Grove. It's a non-warrantable unit. So banks treat it differently. You have to get 20% down. And the reason it's non-warrantable is the ski co owns more than 2 units in those condos.
Right. We had that.
What? That makes no sense.
Right.
We've had that problem before.
And this has come up before. And so figuring out how can we manage that? Are there workarounds? What can we do? Prime example for down payment assistance, maybe for that.
Right.
Maybe it's a conversation with the ski co of, can we change that ownership in some way? HOA fees, a huge issue for affordable housing units, especially if they're connected with free market ones, like in Cedar Grove. So there's 2 HOAs.
Yeah.
Condo owners, which are appreciation capped, pay into the condo association, and they also pay into the master. So it'd be akin to Thompson Corner paying RVR fees and their own.
Wow.
So
Already some loopholes identified, or not loopholes.
adds up really quickly.
Yeah.
And that means a person at a lower income can't afford something because
Right.
they can make the mortgage, but they can't pay the HOA fees.
Yeah.
So some things I don't know how we address that now, but things to consider as we're trying to move these things forward is that there's been some things that we've done that haven't worked that great and we could improve. Yeah.
Very quickly. Cedar Grove, as I remember, was about to go into bankruptcy until Ski-Co stepped in. And that's how they ended up owning so many units there. Is that
Well,
right?
actually, they bought the whole parcel because Mountain Regional Housing Authority, a corporation, which was a community development corporation, couldn't pull it off.
Right.
Yeah, so they did step in, and yeah, they've done a great job for their needs.
I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
The history.
Yeah.
It isn't like they were doing this. They may have been doing it to make money. I don't know. But the whole thing was basically going down the tubes until they stepped in.
They needed housing for their employees.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
they weren't doing it because they like us.
Yeah.
They did it for housing for their employees,
Yeah.
but it also saved the whole project.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's one of those issues Ski-Co didn't know that was going to happen. I'm sure they didn't know that banks then would change their loan requirements because they own, it's not like it was
Yeah.
intentional.
Yeah.
It's this situation that's been created where
Yeah.
then if you have to have a 20% down, then that starts to remove some flexibility for these first time home
Oh, yeah,
buyers. So it's,
definitely.
Yeah.
okay, cool. So that was my addition to this town assessment, which sounds like you already have in your head.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great point. It's also a reason why we might want a housing commission,
Yeah.
a separate that lives on, that deals with these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Rather than it always being us.
Mhm.
And it includes that some people have to live in affordable housing.
Right.
I don't know. There's pros and cons and all that, but
Great point.
I might be ready for it.
Lauren, what are you gonna add to that?
I just have a quick question because I was doing a little research today and because I don't have the corporate.
Lauren's mic, please.
Street in town.
Is your mic on?
Is now. Thank you. But one of the things that I found when I was looking for something else was a bunch of notes and recommendations from an affordable housing committee.
Yeah.
That I guess was formed in 2010 and then maybe fell by the wayside. I haven't read it all yet, and then came back to make recommendations in 2016. But I don't have any of the background on that. But I think that it would be helpful to work through. We have the Garfield County Housing Authority. We have our planning department, which helps run these and monitor these affordable housing units. We now have the Regional Housing Coalition, that maybe there's an actual name, Heather. I know I voted, but and then the question is, what else happens at the town level? Is it a committee? Is it a commission?
No.
Is it, and
Sure.
I don't know the answer to that, but
and I think that's all
How these things
something we
work
should
together
yeah,
is-
we need to figure
Yeah.
out how they work. I think the challenge, at least at the Garfield County Housing Authority level and the regional commission level, is that it's harder for locals to participate. So whether it's a commission or a committee, or, I mean, that's something we can all
Right.
weigh in and figure out what makes the most sense. But I think having some people who live in our units
mhm.
that weigh in, I think could be helpful.
Great. Another item I had was, and we had talked about this, Lauren, is consolidating information about how people can access these existing units. Because it is, I thought it was easier and I was telling people to go someplace, just to like the Garfield County Housing Authority, but that doesn't have all the rentals. And once
Right.
I started digging, I was like, oh, actually, this is really confusing. So I think,
Mhm.
again, just adding it to our communications list
Right.
of like, how can we be a better clearinghouse for that info, even just having it on our website.
I talked to somebody today who's apparently been on the senior housing wait list for 10 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Whoa, no,
I don't,
I'm not
I don't
judging. I'm just
have the
saying,
details.
I've never heard anyone more than
But-
7.
That's so, even 7. It's a
I'm not saying
long
it's
time.
good, but yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, that can get very depressing for somebody who's trying to get in.
Maybe that's part of our, this assessment as well, is because there's also a wait list for Red Hill and Santa Lucia.
Yeah.
But we don't know those off the top of their head. So it's almost like if this spreadsheet were built out a little bit where it's like wait list as of the end of 2022 number, just so that it's in front of us or it's in front of this committees as well.
Don't we have to go 3 different, I mean, Garfield County is Red Hill. Santa Lucia, isn't that Catholic Charities?
Yeah, separate.
That's separate. And then so-called senior housing is actually HUD, which is still a third entity you have to go to.
Right.
Because they're all managed differently.
Yeah, that's why I was,
We do have more detailed information
Yeah.
about these, but the spreadsheet also has some personal information on it. We wouldn't
need that. No.
we didn't want to bring that to public meeting.
The only other thing I had was maybe we flesh out the zoning or policies and zoning component as well. I had written down, I didn't know about these other fee-based programs, but we've had a couple projects, even the marijuana shop that we just approved their license the other night. And so I was biking by there and I was like, maybe we should just require 1 unit on some of these small.
And they said they could do it.
You know, just thinking out loud of like, but maybe a
They
fee-based.
might have to do it just for their own.
Right, I
staffing,
know.
mean,
I think the new bakery that's gonna be built downtown has now added a residential unit up top, where originally it was just gonna be part of their bakery space. So I think people are doing it on their own, but maybe, does that make sense? I don't know. And then,
It's worth, I think that's something we should look at. We should look at all possible ways that we can see if there's an example of someone else doing it and see if it would work here. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like multiple
right.
avenues.
The other one that came up, somebody had emailed me and I've been looking for it to try and forward it on, that some places are relaxing rules that prohibit boarding houses. Because that can be a great way to house seniors, where it's a small house of like 6 people or something, but our zoning might restrict that or not allowed, but they have shared space, a boarding house. And allowing that kind of model of development or for remodeling a house into a boarding house style, which might be prohibited in our zoning. So there might be
Yeah.
some other things like
Yep,
that
absolutely.
that we
Yeah.
could do.
Yeah.
That was all I had for right now.
Great.
Does anybody else have things to add?
I've
Go ahead,
got one
Chris.
question
Or
for
questions?
clarification. Yeah, I've been perpetually confused by this real estate transfer assessment because there are different enclaves in town that have a RETA. Town,
Voluntary.
it's what?
It was voluntary negotiation when they came in for their
In order for-
zoning and planning.
You get their
Gotcha.
approval.
Okay,
But those are the only ones we have, is the ones who have agreed voluntarily to institute them.
as a condition of annexation or whatever it was. Okay, got it. Thank you.
All right, Chris?
Lobby our Democratic candidate for House on this, on the both the trailer parks issue and the ret issue. So I hope that if she's elected, she'll keep that in mind. I did also see an interesting, I think it's definitely early days, and it would be good to sit on the sidelines on this one, but I have noticed, people shared these vacancy tax proposals in Vancouver, Oakland, and Santa Cruz.
Could you describe the vacancy tax concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think they vary a little bit depending on which municipality. I think Vancouver's the one who's done it most aggressively, and obviously they're a big city, so I don't know how applicable it is. Santa Cruz might be more interesting to see. It's on the ballot there this November. So I'll be curious to see what the populace, if they vote on this or not. But I think in that situation, it's like, basically you have to have your driver's license or whatever be your house. You have to be a permanent resident of that's the first hurdle essentially. And then if you don't have that, you have to prove that you've rented it somehow to somebody else, or you're in the short-term rental program. And then if not, then you pay a flat, I think in Santa Cruz, it's a $6,000 flat fee that unoccupied houses in town.
Okay, so someone basically cannot keep a place vacant, assuming that property is gonna go up.
Yeah,
Is
it's
that the
a
idea?
kind of a major, there's a major questions constitutionally about property rights maybe in this question.
Well, I'm not even
But,
speaking about that, but is the idea that,
Tax on second homeowners, essentially. You have
okay,
a second home here, it's just sitting vacant.
Yeah,
okay, there, it's just,
so, I mean, yeah, I've just heard the first of it, so I can't really advocate one way or the other. I think it's just maybe worth keeping an eye on what happens, both the political palatability of that with these jurisdictions, and then the practical questions, because it's as far the minute I dig into it, all the questions are the same things as the short-term rentals around enforcement. And yeah, so.
But I went to that same thing, for sure. Marty.
well, I like the short term, intermediate and long term. With the idea of the short term, and we spoke about a short term rental tax. I'd like us to get that on the ballot this November. Because we have to have a source of funds to do anything. And whether it's 5% or 6%, I don't really care. I think the thing is, doesn't affect the people who live in town. Doesn't affect the owner of the property. They're not paying the tax. It's the person who's renting it for a short-term rental, which I believe we defined as less than 29 days in a row, is the one who's paying it. With our sales tax, 8.4, I believe. And a 2% lodging tax, it's 10.4. With 5 or 6%, that's still less than other communities, the total tax. And this money can go to our housing fund, so we have some ammunition to use. We all know this is a crisis. We all know people who are literally being forced out of town at least one a month, if not more. You know, all of our constituents have said they want us to address it. And all of our businesses say they cannot find employees because they can't find a place to live. So this impacts everyone. And if we don't have money, we can't do anything about it. We can debate what programs we want to put in to address it on a short-term basis, while we continue to look at the intermediate and long-term and come up with some better, funding sources. But if we don't do anything on this ballot, then it's another year and another dozen or 2 dozen people who've been forced out of town.
All right, Heather, I see your hand is up and I am excited to hear from you. Not that I wasn't excited to hear from you or any of you here.
What am I, chopped liver?
Voice in a long time.
Okay.
The dulcet tones.
Hey, everybody. Well, I mean, first of all, Colin, awesome to kind of get this ball rolling. I would say that path for you all to sit down and set these goals. What is it we're trying to achieve in a very specific way? And then what are some of the strategies? I can and see I have to be a little careful. Maybe the is enough that this blanket, we're going to put this towards affordable housing. I think that's definitely turned a lot of people in the past, right? To not have a very concrete plan in place. this is what we want this tax to go, and these are our goals, and this is how we're going to working backwards this evening so far. So Colin is spot on in, he grabbed some of the information from the 2009. And so that number that you see, was basically the gap analysis. When you read through that plan, they also identify the ended, and that was in the hundreds of people were spending more.
Hey, Heather, you're
And that
breaking
was
up. You're breaking up just a little bit.
Sorry. Is that better?
It is about
Trying to
every
get-
time I was about to say something, it gets better. So
Keep talking.
yeah,
Get closer to my Wi-Fi.
there you go. Go stand next to it.
So, yeah, right. Like crawling over it. So
And Heather,
it-
Heather, sorry, it was breaking up so much. Could you just recap the high points? Because you were saying some really important stuff and I missed a few key details of what you just said.
So, well, I was saying I really support you guys sitting down and figuring out those goals. I think that that's hugely important. And I would say it's hugely important before you go to the voters. I mean, maybe the crisis is enough that you get the support without that, but I think having a really solid plan in place is really important. So the next one was that the housing study identified both the gap in like the number of units, but also the number of people who are overextended. So they're spending more than the third they're supposed to do. And that was in the hundreds of millions. So this is people who are already housed that, maybe their mortgage is overextended, or that like identification of HOA fees, things like that is really huge. And that's a really big deal. And one that was identified in that plan as well. So putting together those strategies would be really important, because if you guys put together funding, you thinking creatively, like to tackle both of those things would be really important. Let's see what else. So just a quick update on the Regional Housing Coalition. So I think I copied, I don't know whether I'm supposed to or not, Ben and Colin, Lauren and John. So we have an interview next week. The Housing Coalition is engage someone to help identify our top program priorities. So as you guys know, we're going to be focusing on geographically neutral or development neutral programs. So that's going to be things like rental assistance, down payment assistance, cash buyer, like cash buyer competitive program, buy downs, municipal master leases, just kind of, there's probably a list of 12. So what we're doing is interviewing each municipality. What are the most important to you? What are you interested in the most? What falls to the bottom? So that as a group, we say, hey, these 3 things have really risen to the top. This is what we're going to tackle first. So if you guys are like parallel track with what Colin's kind of gotten started, and I love the idea of like a committee getting together to start to think about these things. And some of those are, user-based individuals that are either in your housing, they're on wait lists, whatever is kind of how you figure out a really broad group. But so if you guys are parallel tracking some of that, I think it's going to be really powerful that Regional Housing Coalition is tackling that and that. Let's put, these things in place here in Carbondale because that's happening there. As far as being part of the state bill that is coming out, a big chunk of that is actually directly going to help fund securing mobile home parks across the state. So if that becomes part of your strategy, I think that would be huge. And there's absolutely money being allocated for that. And then the last point was we have some really interesting ideas around funding, regional funding around like businesses. and employees. It's not ready to hit the press yet, and Dave Myler would be mad at me if I spoke about it in public. So just sort of stay tuned, because I think there's some really interesting ideas. I guess my 2 cents in terms of like for Carbondale, going to some other municipalities to look at their programs, because to me, what you have to be, we struggle to get anyone to build commercial and, you know, fill commercial in Carbondale, and we're a sales tax based community. So I think being careful to burden too much commercial, even though understandably they're generating employees, and I get that. I guess I just, you know, try and find some case studies and that to evaluate that really carefully.
Thanks, Heather. That was really helpful. And maybe just along that lines on the last item is, or are there incentives in play to put in place to incentivize housing be built on top of commercial or something? Because I was wondering that too, because I have heard stories that the rule, you know, I've heard from local businesses here who maybe tried to do a business in Aspen, and that was actually one of their biggest barriers was the cost of providing housing for their employees. So, yeah. But lots of other really great stuff there. Thank you. And thanks for continuing to participate in that, in the Regional Housing Coalition. Super helpful. Ben or Luis, do either of you have anything you want to chime in on or add or summarize?
Why don't you go ahead, Luis, and then I'll jump in. If you have anything.
Sure. I mean, you know, along those same incentives, I wonder if and Colin, thank you so much for such a thorough memo. With ADU, or have we exhausted that pretty much with just incentivizing, you know, with anything that's rent capped or income capped, because there is such large disparity about what is affordable in Carbondale, you know. So I know that gets more obviously into zoning, but just something that came to mind.
So maybe adding that to the policies of just evaluating our ADU rules.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Well, especially since my understanding is it's like 70% of the town can't have ADUs because they're PUDs.
Right.
So, but it's worth the conversation. I mean, I think it's come up in RVR, some people wanting to have ADUs, but they can't. So.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of, there's no process at all for that happening to a PUD?
You would just have to amend the PUD and you'd have to get everybody supporting it within the PUD.
It'd have to be unanimous.
I don't know what the
67%.
67, it's already been thought.
There we go. That's some knowledge.
Or I have said this a couple times, I have not done it. You could circulate a petition around your neighborhood PUD and what is it, let go of your PUD? What's the word? Dissolve it and join the town code or zoning. Which I think, like in my neighborhood, there's, you know, I can think of 6 houses I can see from my house that have non-complying apartments because they can't have an ADU. In fact, there's one right around the corner that even has 2 of them. And it's that kind of like big house that it works. Like they live upstairs and they created 2 apartments on their garden level. So I think my neighborhood would be up for it. I just have to go do it. But that could be part of our strategies is like expanding ADUs across town.
And it also could be driven by the PUD. I mean, I don't think we're going to RVR saying, hey, you need ADUs. It'd be more if they want to, we talk to them about it.
Yeah.
But that may be a communication thing of that's why it's not happening in your neighborhood.
Yeah,
Specifically.
absolutely. Yeah.
And if you want to change it, you're gonna have to deal with your own.
Well, and that it can be changed, but
yeah,
that's not easy necessarily.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in, Erica, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
I mean, I appreciate Colin as well. This memo is helping us get started on a big topic that we know we need to address in like a more systematic way. And I feel like the biggest question tonight is really just about process going forward. And to me, the key part of that is, do we establish this other group, whatever we want to call it, board, commission, task force, committee, whatever, or do we tackle this ourselves? And I think that somebody a moment ago was making the point, I think it was Lauren, that, you know, there's a lot of groups working on this. So I'm interested in whatever will get us the most quickly moving forward on this. You know, we've also got some pretty specific recommendations in the comp plan. So I just feel like that might be worth our last couple of minutes of discussion here, is whether we want to establish a task force and give them a short time period and say, you know, in 2 months, come back to us with recommended goals. And then within 2 months, some recommended strategies along these lines. And then, you know, like a 6-month sort of total, something like that, rather than just a committee that meets once a month till the end of time. Or that we dedicate enough time on our agendas for the next 6 months or so, and we invite some key people in and we tackle these ourselves. And I could honestly see it working either way. I don't feel super strongly about that specific decision. So I'm just curious if that's something we want to discuss, because I feel like what we need to leave with right now is not, you know, what we're going to do on any specific topic within this. It's just how we're going to move forward.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead.
If I get in trouble.
Good job.
Thank you. The question that I have for you, Ben, or for anybody on the board is, let's say there's a task force. Does the task force come first and work on the statement of where we are and setting the goals? Or does the board set where we are, set the goals, and then charge the task force with coming up with action items to be able to meet those goals? I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just wondering what you have in mind.
Yeah, that's a good question, Lauren, and I could see it going either way. Like, I think that we could set these goals, but again, it's going to take some time for somebody to be tasked with researching what the other communities are, you know, what their goals are, and bringing that to us, you know. So I could see it working either way, but it will require some staff time and to support it, whether it's a commission or whether it's us.
I had the same question as Lauren, just for us to ponder. Like, do we have more to flesh out before we hand it off to a task force? Partly because I think of, so we provide more guidance and help them, because just handing off a big topic to a group of citizens who maybe haven't been putting a ton of thought into it like we have, you know, might not set them up for success, or it might be exactly what we want. So
I would think we want to spend a little bit more time flushing this out before we bring other folks in. And also just, we have the time and we have to get a ballot question resolved. So I would suggest that we take some time in a subsequent meetings, flush out some of these goals, and we can continue to have this discussion about what do we want a group to do. And I think as we work our way through this, it'll become more clear what we're asking for them. Because I think some of the goals are very high level, and some of them get into the nitty gritty of how do we get on this? And I don't like how they did that. I mean, it could play different roles. And I think we need to be really clear about that before we invite people to give us their time. Yeah, too soon. I think we got a little time on the committee approach.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I did, Heather, I did see your chat saying you love the idea of a 12-month task force. So thank you for chiming in.
Yeah. The rest of you guys are on track, right? Spending more time so that your task force has a clear outline of your goals.
Yeah. Yep. Ready.
Excuse me. I think specifically for the intermediate and long term, we need that. We need the task force. We need to give it 12 months. We need to come up with other funding sources. I think for the immediate, for the 1 year to 3 year, we can't wait another year to appoint a task force and give them a year and have them come back with a plan to address the immediate. I mean, this is going on right now every single month. And I don't think the 5% STR, we could always rescind it. We could always make it a, what do you call it? where it will disappear.
Sunset.
Sunset, thank you. Where it'll sunset after 3 years, you know, to give them time to come up with another plan, if that's what they want. But I think, and it isn't going to get us enough money to solve a tenth of the problems out there. But if we can, whether through using our neighbors like Eagle with mortgage buy downs, with a rent subsidy, with helping people with a down payment in exchange for a second mortgage and an equity stake in their home, I think it's a place we can start and impact at least some of our residents without telling them, oh yeah, we know it's a problem. We've known it's been a problem for 5 years. And now we're going to appoint a task force and we'll see what they say a year from now.
Yeah.
Task force is great. We need that. But we also need to do something now.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. We get resolve the question around SDR lodging, get that on the ballot. And then the 1 to 3 year stuff is the task force.
I mean, an SDR which sunsets in 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, and there will be other funding resources, but this is a resource people have told us about the SDRs, their concerns, and they're telling us about. We've had people in this room crying that they have to move because they can't find any place here. We have employers saying they have to close because they can't find employees. This is a real immediate problem that I don't think we can afford to wait another year or two before we first start addressing. Intermediate and long-term, definitely. Support that 100%. But on the short term, I don't think we can wait.
Totally agree.
I feel like Colin's done an excellent job of laying out the goals. For my mind, I don't know how much more I need to get that fleshed out or I mean, it would be great to have more input and maybe more specificity as we go, but I feel like this is a great starting point for this, you know, we've got some good categories here of the town center site, these non-development neutral things, funding sources, zoning, and then maybe trailer parks in particular or whatever. I feel like we kind of almost have a mandate if we have a committee or whatever. I guess it is maybe more a question of, are they going to focus more on development of new stuff or, you know, advancing the program, or are they, if they're like residents of existing affordable housing, are they going to be like APCHA seems to deal with a lot of existing inter-conflict stuff, you know, about existing issues within the units that are already there or whatever. I would assume this is more about expanding than that latter part, but no.
I guess on the assessing our existing is ensuring that it is actually being used as it was intended. And so I think it's both, because it might be, because if there's units out there that are not actually affordable and we're counting them as affordable, then is there anything we can do to change that? Or is it just like a lesson, heads up, look, we need a new policy for this kind of development going forward or something. So I think then that could be, they could be enlightening on that from their perspective. So it might be kind of both. But maybe I was just going to add, so maybe one of our next steps is really articulating that role. What is the role of a task force or a commission? What is the role of staff? And we would need, as we build capacity, what would staff be able to support? And then there are these bigger picture items. What's the role of our board? And it's almost, you can tell who I've worked for the last 12 years, an action chart of some sort where we kind of start putting some of this into a table or something where it's like, here's who's responsible, or I don't want to say responsible, go solve it, but this is whose plate this would be on. And that might help us think through, because there'll still be stuff that we have to keep thinking through, like the policies or work with planning and zoning. So there's a lot of other components we can add to this.
Yeah.
Marty.
I'll be very brief. But one of the things that comes up is people who have deed restricted or income restricted units? Who's making sure they're in compliance? Okay, this has been a huge problem in Aspen. You know, they've had people who've had deed restricted housing who've lived there 3 months out of the year and rented out 9 months out of the year. Or people that met the income requirements when they moved in there 8 years ago, but don't meet them anymore. And I don't want to see people evicted, but by the same token, if we're saying this is for people with a certain amount percentage of AMI, then if someone's making 150% of AMI, they no longer meet the requirements of that unit.
Yeah, so I think that could, yep, be part of the assessment.
In general, I just feel like we understand the broad strokes of the problem, and I think Colin's done a great job of organizing our thoughts in the 30,000 feet view. And I think there is more value, going back to Lauren's question about, are we grasping at straws for them to help us shape the whole program, or are we giving them a charge? I think the latter is more useful if we can give them a defined, you know, smaller scale, maybe something they can actually be doing research or in getting information or finding grant related things for us, or find, how do we do this stuff? You know, I guess that would be to me.
So would our next step be, and please do chime in, Ben. Oh, your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, I just
Go
want to jump. I think we need to get out of the weeds for now and just say our next step is to schedule another meeting. Laura and I will work on the agenda date, but I think we could commit to this, that once a month we're going to spend some meeting time. So we'll find a time in August. And I think our goal at that meeting will be to look at specific goals. So the chart that Colin provided, you know, in blue, he just sort of made up numbers, right, Colin?
Yep.
Which is great. And so I think we don't make up numbers next, right? We go and we actually look at what those numbers should be. And we talk a little bit more about next steps for a task force, but we don't discuss any more detail than that right now.
And keep in mind that hopefully we will have a new planning director. Who's
great.
Now has some housing planning in the job description.
Cool. Yep. Yeah, and I think along those lines, acknowledging that staff is doing a lot of hiring right now. And so I don't want it to be where we're like creating a bunch of work to get done now by staff. So
and then in terms of the immediate, at our next meeting, we're going to talk about SDR. We're going to confirm that we're going forward on, and we figure out what's the amount and does it sunset or not.
Yeah, I mean, those are things we can discuss.
Yep, absolutely.
Those are things we should discuss.
Yep.
But as a short term, we can't put it off for another year or two.
No.
yeah, I don't think
That's a short
anybody,
term.
and
I don't think anybody said that either.
Heather's point about that's what the regional efforts focusing on. If we can, I don't know how they're going to set that up, matching funds or whatever, that could be great. And then we can really get going if we can leverage some of the resources they have. Perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Does that feel like we're at a good spot? Colin, you feel good?
Yeah. Terrific.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Lana, you've been quiet.
I'm waterlogged.
You put it all into the water discussion.
And plus you won't be out fishing, so.
I guess at some point we may encounter some question of whether there's again, this depends how far the town center thing moves along, but whether that's its own enchilada or not. You know,
I mean, in some ways it is its own enchilada, but it definitely feeds into what we're trying to accomplish. And then the question is, how much can it accomplish?
And that's the.
We should have at a certain point, not too far in the future, that an RFQ to go out to say, you know, bring your best ideas. This is what we want to have here.
Yeah.
This is what we don't want to have here. What do you got for us?
Yeah.
Just based on the information or the interest, I feel like, well, with the Catholic Charities and Habitat and Art Space, with the interest from all these different entities, it almost feels like now we have more potential developer interest in this one parcel than necessarily we have space. Well, I mean, we could still talk about it and see how amenable they are to be working with each other closely. But maybe if we're if we're thinking about that site, but also holistically in terms of the whole town and saying, what are we also thinking about other little pieces of property around town that maybe we want to say, let's divert this project to focus on that parcel. They can have their own party or whatever if they want, yeah.
Right. And I think, I mean, that's how I think of it. If in terms of us raising the funds to pay for employee housing or to finance our own project is either, it might be a parcel of that. And maybe it is, because I think when Bob was talking about it, it could be kind of parceled out literally.
Yeah.
Where it is a few for Habitat or a few for Catholic Charities. And they could get started on those almost, and then ours come later or
Yeah.
something like it could be part of this plan, but I wouldn't see us holding off on moving forward with that
No.
to get all this plan in
Oh,
place.
no, no, no.
Yeah, they can happen at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah. Hopefully this is all supporting all the other decisions we're trying to make around housing, all opportunities we have.
Okay, if there's no more online, Ben, Luis, Heather.
No, I mean, I noticed Andrea was here. I didn't know if it's 9:08, but were we talking about the STR thing or the lodging tax tonight, or are we talking about that next week?
I think we heard a little bit, but I don't think we need to decide tonight.
Okay.
So it sounds like next week.
Okay, sorry, Andrea.
I think.
Ben, I told Andrea that, that we put the lodging tax on to tonight's agenda because lodging tax / STR tax or whatever that sort of fundraising effort was, would have some relationship to Colin's memo with affordable housing, and that it might come up, but that it was not a particular focus of this meeting.
Okay.
But that I probably would next week when the board could have some votes, make some decisions on it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I don't know if that's okay with you or if you'd like
Yeah,
to.
no, that's perfect. I just wanted to make sure if she had waited through this whole meeting that we
Yeah,
gave her
she was aware.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrea.
And she just posted a comment, says, great conversation tonight. Thanks. Thank you, Andrea. All right. And I think that's a meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
It's a
Sarah.
work session. I don't have to pound the hammer.
Volunteer to try and test.